Belinda presents this unabridged recording of The Homestead Girls, written by Fiona MacArthur and read by Caroline Lee. The dedication reads, "To the Royal Flying Doctor Service, their incredible flight nurses, flying doctors, and outreach clinic care providers, the control room coordinators, the mechanics, and the pilots who get them there safely, and to those who raise funds to help support this incredible service. You are all heroes." Prologue. Today, Layla had a jelly bean up her nose. Last week, she'd pushed a pebble in her ear. Dr. Billy Green patted the arm of the worried mother because this so reminded her of her own daughter, Mia, as a little girl, when she'd vied for attention in their busy life. But it was pointless to wish that her 16-year-old daughter was as adorable as she'd been all those years ago. Flipping through the sterile packets of instruments for the long-nosed artery forceps, Billy tried not to wonder just what Mia was up to right at this moment as she tilted this little girl's face to the light. Before her previous patient, Billy had called home, and the house phone had rung out. Sometimes it was hard to keep up with her daughter. This was the problem with being a single parent, and the unanswered call meant worrying that maybe Mia was out doing something she shouldn't be. "Focus on the job at hand," she reminded herself. "Okay, sweetheart, hold still and I'll get that yucky thing out of your nose." With one hand on the tiny chin and the other on the instrument, Billy directed the metal forceps towards the offending object, her lips twitching at the sight of the red bean-smeared nostril. After initial resistance, the jelly bean slid out with a final firm tug. Success. Billy's eyes met those of the mother, and they both released pent-up breaths and grinned. "Thank you, Dr. Green." The mum scooped up her daughter and hugged her with relief. Billy winked at Layla, then she bypassed the lolly jar that she used when she needed to bribe nervous young patients and chose the rubber handprint. "Stamp?" "Please." "Good choice. No more nose poking." Layla solemnly shook her head and held out her hand for Billy to brand it with the bright-coloured bunny outline. They all looked at it. It was pink and perfect, like a tiny tattoo on the white skin. Layla's mum hugged her close once more. "Say thank you to Dr. Green." "Thanks." Billy rubbed the fine strands of blonde hair on her patient's adorable head. "You are such a good girl. If only every little girl could be so easy." Including her daughter. She flicked another look at the clock. Nearly 8 p.m. She showed them out of her consulting room, and there were no more patients waiting. Someone else was, though. "Dr. Green?" Billy's pulse rate jumped as the man in the blue uniform straightened off the wall of her office and stepped forward. "Yes?" Gruffly, but not unkindly, he said, "I'm Sergeant Hill. A word with you in private?" "Of course, come in." She looked across at the receptionist, who raised her shoulders in a worried shrug. They'd find out soon enough. As soon as she'd shut the door, she asked, "Is my daughter okay?" "That would be Miss Mia Rose Green?" "Yes." Cold terror flooded her. It was Mia. Now Billy struggled to contain the fear that closed her throat. An accident? Blood? Broken bones? Molested? Her father? "Tell me." "Your daughter's detained at the police station, though she'll be released into your care as soon as you come to collect her." Relief sagged her shoulders until other implications sank in. Trouble, then. Better than physical harm, although she still dreaded the answer to her next question. What's she done? He sighed, and she could tell he hated this. Probably had kids Mia's age as well. "Were you aware it's high school muck-up tonight?" No, she hadn't been, or she'd have made sure someone had stayed home with Mia. The local kids had been getting rowdier every year. Last year's high school leaving students had painted the town toilet block iridescent yellow and stuck feathers all over the concrete walls. And the local McDonald's sign had mysteriously flown to the top of the school auditorium. The authorities still didn't know how they'd managed to get it there. Your daughter was a passenger in a car that we apprehended this evening. The driver and his passengers accosted a security guard, wearing balaclavas to obscure their faces. They were brandishing toy guns. Billy plonked inelegantly into the chair behind her desk. Mia was grounded. And just who had she been riding around with in a car at night? Then the true horror of how she could have been hurt if the security guard had been armed sank in. What if they'd done it to a police car? They could have been shot. The policeman went on. Your daughter's fortunate. No charges will be laid because of her age, but we've taken a statement from all of them. The 19-year-old driver will appear in court. She'd bet it was that creepy Jensen who'd been turning up late at night wanting to see Mia. Who was driving? The policeman avoided her eyes, and she had the feeling he was the kind of man who would want to know who was driving if it had been his teenager in the back seat. I'm not at liberty to say, but you can ask your daughter when you come to the station. My word, she'd ask her daughter when she came to the station. Billy checked the clock on her office wall again. Her evening clinic would finish in 3 minutes anyway. I'll follow you in my car. She thought she sounded calm. Hopefully the policeman couldn't see the steam coming out of her ears. But her car keys dug into her palm as she followed him out and closed her office door with a forceful click. She rolled her eyes at the receptionist as she went past, but didn't see her response because she was thinking, how many times have I told you to choose your friends wisely? You wait, Miss Mia. You are in so much trouble. I'm getting you away from here before you make the same mistake I did. Chapter 1. A month later, and 1,200 kilometres away on a drought-stricken sheep and cattle station in far western New South Wales, Soretta Burns scanned the distance through her kitchen window. The paddock stretched away down the hill, the greenish blue of the saltbush, red dirt, and maroon rocks poking through the cracked soil and dust. She wanted to throw on her boots and head out again, check the ewe she was worried about, just potter around on the quad with the dogs before it got dark to make sure the troughs were still filling with bore water. But she needed to make tea. It was days like this that she missed Gran the most. It was as if the house had lost its heart. Oh, she used the cedar oil, kept the floorboards shiny, did it for the comfort of hearing Gran's gentle voice in her head saying, just 15 minutes a day and your house is a home. But a house wasn't a home without people, and hopefully the horizon would yield a small dust ball, 2 quad bikes and her grandfather before sunset. It was a long way home from their joint boundary with the next door station in the dark. Peripherally, she heard the creak of the windmill as it pumped water from the hard ground. But this afternoon, her skin prickled with premonition instead of the subtle calming effect the pump's cadence usually had on her. Even the grand old homestead, a home she and her grandfather both had rattled around in since her grandmother had died, felt claustrophobic. It was her 22nd birthday today. Lucky I'm not precious, she murmured, and swiped a date out of the packet in the door of the fridge. Maybe she could make scones and put a candle on top. Grandad might like that, and she was almost at the sing and dance stage of trying to cheer him up. Maybe she had it wrong, and he'd remember it was her birthday, breeze in and say, pretty yourself up, sweetheart. I'm taking you all the way into town for dinner. Highly unlikely. Not that she blamed him. In the last 18 months, they hadn't seen any decent rain. The dams were dry for the first time in years, and her granddad's dream of climbing out of spiralling debt had shriveled into dust, along with the grass in the home paddock and the weaker sheep. Mustering feral goats was the only thing keeping them going. She had this mounting dread he'd do something silly, like put the place on the market if the rain didn't come soon. The spectre of depression, an evilly charismatic black wraith, had touched other drought-stricken families. And for the first time, she worried about her own grandfather. Lately, he barely spoke to her. Soretta glared at the empty fridge until the roar of a quad bike coming up the track lifted her head, and she moved to the creaking screen door to step out onto the veranda. The one backpacker who hadn't abandoned them had been known to be a little reckless, but there was something unsettling about the speed of this approach, and the hairs on the back of her neck waved again, uneasily. Klaus jumped from the quad almost before it stopped. "Boss down. Hit an anthill on the quad bike. He landed on a mulga root. Lots of blood." She clamped down on the gory picture that sprang immediately to her mind. "Where?" "Next door boundary. We use that holding yard for this muster. Near airstrip. Phone smashed. You get a flying doctor." Klaus's usual florid face was pale and sickly with shock and stress. This was bad. Soretta felt the panic flutter in her throat, and she squashed it down too. It would have taken 40 minutes for Klaus to get to her. Her granddad had been alone that long. "Go back to him. I'll bring the utility." Klaus nodded, jumped back onto the bike, and roared away. Soretta jerked open the screen door and sprinted up the hallway to the phone on the wall. Her granddad was injured. Klaus's words were screaming like neon lights in her head, hitting the ground at speed, speared by a mulga root, lots of blood. Even Granddad wasn't invincible. He'd be all right. He'd better be all right. He was all she had in the world. Daphne Prince glanced out the window of the office as the aircraft lifted off with the flight crew from the next shift, and narrowed her eyes as it disappeared into the sunset. Another night on call for any emergencies until they came back, but that was okay. The control room at Broken Hill would phone her at home until 7 the next morning. She loved her job, was falling in love with the country, even though she'd been a city girl her entire life, and she was fiercely proud of the whole flying doctor service she'd joined. For one thing, having to deal with emergency medical situations with very little help had certainly brought her out of her shell. "Don't suppose there's any more of that coconut slice?" Rex was holding his hand out dolefully like Oliver Twist. "Please, Mom, is there more?" "No, I think you've eaten it all, Rex." She grinned at the hopeful expression on the pilot's face. Just looking at him made her feel warm inside. She had no expectations, but passing time with the delightful Rex was no hardship. Besides, she had nothing else to go home for. At least she'd found a job she loved. She might be vertically challenged or suffering from duck's disease, as her ex-husband had told everyone. Even here, she had the nickname Legs. But it was useful being small when you were crawling around inside a tiny aircraft for most of your working day. Tonight was a shame, though. She'd been looking forward to meeting the new female doctor, and now it was likely she'd be called out. The doctor and her daughter would have arrived by now to share the other side of the duplex Daphne lived in. It would be good to have another woman around here. There was more than enough testosterone, with the boss, Rex, and the other nurses and pilots all being male. The Mica Ridge base didn't take calls 24 hours a day. They were coordinated from Broken Hill. But Daphne and Rex were on call until the team came back. With Morgan here as senior doctor, the base had an extra person during office hours, and with the new doctor, his load would be lightened too. Maybe Daphne wouldn't be needed tonight, and as soon as the others returned, she'd be able to relax. The phone rang, and Daphne scooped it up, heard a strangled, "Come on," on the other end, and instantly recognised the stress of an emergency. She heard a deep breath as the caller collected herself. "Daphne, thank God, it's Soretta Burns from Blue Hill Station." Daphne switched the phone to loudspeaker so Rex could hear and prepare as she listened and wrote swiftly. 70-year-old male. Impact off high-speed quad bike. Lord, she hated those quad bikes, Daphne thought. Impaled by mulga root. Daphne winced. Abdominal wound. Extent not seen by caller. Back paddock, Blue Hill Station. Closest airstrip, adjoining station. Large blood loss. She looked over at Rex, who stood to study the map. "I'll switch the phone through to Morgan and let him know we're out," Rex said. "Just over 90K. Landing in 40 minutes. Daphne relayed that. "Don't move him without a spine board. We'll move him when we get there. Can you try to meet us at the airstrip with the utility, and we'll transfer the gear to him?" The caller agreed and hung up, and Daphne scooted out from behind the desk. They'd need extra fluids, pain relief, if he was well enough, extra sponges for a pressure bandage, and battery packs for basic life support equipment. Rex was gone, and pre-flight checks would be well underway by the time she scooped her essentials and headed out the door to the plane. This was always the hardest part, trying to imagine scenarios, preempt disaster, prepare for every eventuality, when, really, you couldn't. She walked as fast as due care would allow. Morgan would skin her alive if she slipped and fell because she was hurrying too much. By the time she'd stowed her extra gear, Rex was pulling the door shut behind her, and she held her breath as he squeezed past into the cockpit. Best part of the day, really, Rex squeezing past. She smiled to herself, then switched back into rescue mode. Listening to the whir of the engines as they began to warm, she willed Soretta to stay calm, and willed Soretta's grandfather to stay alive, because if he did his part, they'd do theirs. Soretta wasn't going to move him, but the bleeding wouldn't stop, and she decided if they were very careful, they could put him on the board that stayed strapped to the back of the ute for emergencies like this. If she didn't move him, it could be too late by the time the plane arrived. It was an agonizingly long time later that she and Klaus finally had her grandfather in the back of the utility. They were nearly there now, but her grandfather's white face glistened with shock and pain as they bounced as gently as Klaus could navigate the potholes over the rough track to the airstrip on the neighbour's property. Soretta's face felt tight, petrified like the piece of mulga that had caused such damage, as she settled the blanket around her grandfather's bony shoulders and tried to keep from crying. One of the hardest things she'd ever done was shift her granddad onto the stretcher board, and she hoped she'd done the right thing. His pale face, the beads of sweat as he'd tried to hold back the groans of agony, and the way the bleeding had continued to seep around the wad of dressing she'd held, had warned her there was no other option. "Hang in there, Grandad." "Sorry, hun." His voice was so damn thready. "Don't you dare die." She heard the squeak in her tone as she fought down the panic. The drone of a plane caught her attention, and she held her breath as she watched it and prayed like she'd never prayed before. Mentally, she hurried it onto the ground and willed the door to open. Soretta sucked in a breath as her head began to swim. It was okay, she chanted to herself. They'd be able to get him to help before it was too late. "You were a beautiful baby," Her grandfather's hoarse whisper held a smile. "Now you look like your grandmother, even more beautiful." "No, that sounded way too much like goodbye." "Save your strength," she said fiercely. "We're nearly there." And then they were coming around the end of the airstrip as the plane taxied towards them. She turned to her grandfather to tell him, but his eyes were closed. For a horrific moment, she thought he was gone, but then she saw his chest rise as he drew another ragged breath. Klaus jolted the utility to a stop, but her granddad was unconscious and didn't notice. Soretta willed him to stay with her. The hatch of the plane lowered, the steps followed, and then there was Daphne. Calm, kind, and brilliantly efficient as she hopped down onto the ground and sprinted with her kit across to them. Soretta had never been so glad to see someone in her life. Soretta eased back as Daphne skidded to a halt beside them. She saw the flight nurse's quick, assessing glance that, despite its speed, seemed to encompass her granddad from head to foot. How did she do that? "I had to move him." "I think you did. You did the right thing." Daphne gently lifted Soretta's hand, and the wadded dressing she held clamped against him. She sucked air in through her teeth at the jagged, seeping wound. "Good job," she said. Soretta didn't know if she was talking to her or her grandfather, but the relief of handing over responsibility made her head swim again. Daphne went on in that quiet, steady voice, and some of the rigid tension in Soretta's neck eased a fraction. "I'll just reinforce this, strap it down more firmly so it won't shift in flight, and get a couple of intravenous lines in." Daphne shot her a look. "Can you hold this again firmly while Rex rolls him so I can slip the bandage under?" Soretta hadn't even noticed the pilot had crouched down beside them. "Of course." It was done swiftly, much more securely than Soretta had been able to manage, and then a bag of intravenous fluids was thrust into her hands. "And this, sweetie, just hold it up when I say." Within seconds, 2 bags of fluid were raised over her granddad. 15 minutes later, Soretta sat quietly in the spare seat in the tiny aircraft cabin and watched Daphne struggle to keep her grandfather alive as the pilot revved the engines. Twin IV lines ran fluid into his veins on each wrist. Oxygen blew into the mask on his face, and the compression bandage on his stomach had finally stopped seeping. But still, her chest felt leaden with anxiety as she listened to the increasing timbre of the plane's engines as at last they began to take off. Billy Green made the turn into the main road of the outback town and breathed a sigh of relief. She was finally on her way to achieving her dream of joining the Micah Ridge Flying Doctor Service. This was something she'd been planning to do since she was a child. Micah Ridge, the next biggest town to Broken Hill on the border of New South Wales and South Australia, was a long way from boys in balaclavas, or the past she'd worked so hard to forget. But here, with the barrier ranges to her back and the Menindee Plains in front of her, she could feel the sense of impending doom about her daughter seep away. It felt good to come back to the place where she'd grown up, and it felt safe for Mia. 18 years, a daughter, and her medical career later, she was returning stronger than when she'd left Micah Ridge as a heartbroken orphan. A lot of that had to do with the elderly aunt who'd believed Billy could do anything, no matter what obstacles appeared. And there had been obstacles. Billy guessed she needed to practice her aunt's kind of faith in Mia, because obviously trying to protect her daughter from the world wasn't working. Today, even during Mia's time as a learner driver at the wheel, she had bombarded Billy with her tirade against moving. Mia had been like an angry bee trapped against the glass as she'd railed bitterly about being uprooted from her friends and familiar surroundings. Her daughter's quite impressive stamina had lasted most of the trip yesterday and today. She'd only been diverted when one of the families of emus had run beside the car, or one of the majestic wedge-tailed eagles had soared from the side of the road. 2 days of anarchy Mia, and Billy's head had felt like it was going to explode. Billy could see Mia's black hair swiveling as they both got out of the car so Billy could drive through the built-up area. Apparently, Mia didn't think it was a built-up area. "You have to be kidding me," she heard Mia mutter. "What did you expect?" Billy said mildly as she met those green eyes, which everyone said were so beautiful and so unlike Billy's blue ones, then watched them widen with horror at the stark contrast a country mining town was proving to be to cosmopolitan Sydney. Billy lifted her eyes to the skyline for strength, felt the squeeze of homecoming again. She'd loved those peaks. Apparently, Mia wasn't appreciating the last rays of the sun that tinged the clouds pink and fairy-flossed each jagged ridge rising from the creviced rocks, drawing in the tourists. They drove off again, and at this time of the day, with the quiet streets of tiny restored miners' cottages and the magnificent heritage buildings from a long-gone mining boom, Billy could see there might be little to excite a teenager. But Billy saw the banks of roses everywhere. How could she have forgotten they bloomed so magnificently out here? And they were in front of every civic building and every yard, as if the hot, dry world was just what they'd ordered. Peace settled over her. There was so much more to this place than Mia knew. "I can see why you haven't been back since you were my age," Mia said. "No, you don't. I would have come earlier, except you kicked and screamed so much about leaving Sydney." She didn't say it again, or comment on Mia's checkered last year. The schools are good, and Outback people are amazing. A snort. "What people?" Billy suppressed a sigh. "You'll see." As if to support her words, as they drove further down the one wide main street, they began to see movement under the big overhanging verandas outside the shops. Saw tourists peering into an old-fashioned department store turned into an art gallery, an early 1900s legal firm refurbished and morphed into stylish apartments with scalloped wood and marble ledges, people taking photos of the magnificent clock tower of the post office, and the austerely elegant police station that loomed in a circle of glowing peace roses. Then the biggest pub came into view. A grand old lady, with upstairs verandas circled in white lace railings, while downstairs tables spilled out onto the wide footpath under a trellis covered in green-leaved grapevines, beckoning travellers to share the oasis in the heat. Even Mia gave a grudging nod. Billy smiled with relief. It was even better than she remembered. "See? Not what you expected after the arid land of the last few 100 kilometres. Not as big as Broken Hill, but just as good," Billy said, remembering the sometimes not-so-friendly rivalry between the two towns. Mia sat up higher as she spied a posse of six-packed cowboys leaning on their four-wheel-drive utes, whip aerials, dish-sized spotlights, and rear mud flaps, all bigger than necessary. They all had Akubra hats glued to their heads in expectation of a good time in town. Billy remembered them, the boys from the bush. She bit back her smile so her daughter couldn't see her amusement. At the end of the main block, there was a shopping centre where once there'd been a horse paddock, and they began to see more townsfolk. Families with toddlers. elderly couples moving towards the caravans parked at the side of the road, smartly dressed businesswomen, testimony to a town that had reinvented itself as an artist's mecca and a hub of tourism. Her daughter offered a seemingly reluctant, "We'll see," but her neck stretched sideways as she watched the young men disappear in the rear vision mirror, and the bracelets on her wrist jangled as her hand went unconsciously to her black ponytail. Billy sighed. She hadn't moved Mia here to fall into the same traps she'd been heading towards in Sydney. She'd hoped her daughter would dive into her studies again with a new school and a clean record, but she guessed change had to come from within. But there was always hope. Her aunt had always said anyone could make mistakes, and Billy's blunders had been monumental. She turned left towards the Flying Doctor base, away from the direction her parents' house lay, as if it was still there. Those memories were for another day and a quiet moment, but she would go there soon, lay to rest the gnawing feeling of needing to say goodbye to her late childhood, which had been left so abruptly. No, today was for the shared housing on the outskirts of town they'd been offered as an easy transition. She didn't think they'd be there long. Billy wanted a more permanent place to live. She wanted to finally put down roots, think of a life for herself as a woman, not just a mother, because soon Mia would finish school. Maybe she could purchase a property with an overseer close to town. The utopia of waking up to no neighbours, no passing cars, a vista to restore her soul, seemed almost within reach. Good grief, where had that come from? "Where's the school?" Billy's least favourite tone grated in Mia's petulant voice. Billy snapped back into parent mode. She was good at that. "Halfway between here and that pub you're so interested in." "Who? Me?" But there was a reluctant smile from Mia, and Billy relaxed a little. The surly princess act had been getting old. She checked the house numbers and pulled up outside a modest grey-painted duplex, sensibly constructed with a concrete block that looked more depressing than welcoming, the whole yard encased in a running blank wall of brown colour-bond fence. She bit back a sigh. "We're here," she said brightly. Mia looked at the uninspiring duplex and concreted yard. "Goody." She rolled her eyes. Oh dear, there had been a lot of similar places in the last 10 years. "Let's get unpacked. We've got a big day tomorrow." Mia's response was a hunch of her shoulders and a snort. "You've got a big day. You'll be doing what you've always wanted to do. I'm doing what I'm told." "Nice change. How about we unload the car and sort our gear?" Billy's mild comment seemed to have the desired effect, because Mia slid from the car and opened the hatchback. They always travelled light. Her rule for so many years. Imagine if she changed that. Let herself accumulate possessions instead of constantly being aware that they'd be moving on. Billy peered under the lid of the tin mailbox at the head of the path and lifted out an envelope with her name on it. She smiled wearily. "We have a key. Good start." Chapter 2. Daphne shrugged the tightness out of her shoulders and waggled her head to loosen her neck. A 15-hour shift wasn't going to stop her calling in to make sure Lachlan Burns and Soretta were okay. They'd rushed Lachlan straight from the plane into an operating theatre, and an hour ago he'd been holding his own, but still in recovery. The nurses thought he'd make it, but it would be a while before he'd be back riding quad bikes again. Though he probably would. At 70, the accident he'd had would have killed a lesser man. A testimony to what a tough old boot he really was. Daphne had picked up noodles and fried rice for a late supper and a plastic bottle of iced coffee because the girl looked half-starved. Daphne was sure Soretta was doing the workload of 3 men out there on the station. She'd also picked up a slightly stale iced cupcake and 1 candle. Some birthday the poor girl had been subjected to. A fact she'd discovered when she'd asked Soretta how old she was. Daphne had no doubt that if the birthday girl hadn't been so shaken by the accident, she'd never have told her that. She nodded to the nurse at the desk and thought wryly how already they were used to her dropping back to check on patients she'd brought in. A yawn crept up on her, and she bit it back as she knocked quietly on the door frame of the waiting room. She glanced at the plastic swing doors into the operating theatres and recovery to her left, but they hung silently in the deserted corridor. Soretta jumped up, and then her face fell when she realised it wasn't someone to tell her about her grandfather. Daphne watched the effort Soretta put into trying to smile and felt her heart contract. To hide the fact that she'd seen it, Daphne put the carry bag of food on the table, but she couldn't ignore what came naturally, and she stepped in to put her hands around the young woman's back and give her a brief hug. After a few seconds, Soretta relaxed and hugged her in return. She wasn't very good at it. That was okay. Daphne was. Then Soretta stepped back. "Daphne, you didn't have to come." "Of course I did. Have you heard anything?" Soretta lifted her head as though it weighed as much as one of those boulders that crowned the ridges outside of town. "He's in recovery, and he's alive." "They make them hardy out here." Soretta almost laughed, but it turned into a sob. Her hand flew to her mouth as if it was the absolute worst noise she could have let out. Daphne's voice lowered until it was almost a whisper. "You're allowed to cry, you know. I won't tell anyone." Soretta sniffed it all back and set her mouth firmly. "And studies suggest tears are endorphins, so when they soak into your skin, they make you feel better." Soretta sniffed again, and then, despite herself, she did smile weakly. "You're a beautiful lady." Daphne looked away. Compliments about her looks made her uncomfortable. To be honest, any compliments made her uncomfortable because she didn't believe them. But that wasn't Soretta's fault. She'd held on to lots of hang-ups from childhood. "Not so sure about that one, but I did bring food. Have you eaten?" A shake of a red ponytail. "I couldn't." "Try now. He's in recovery and would probably prefer if you didn't faint when you see him." This time, Soretta produced a real smile, peered into the white plastic carry bag and sighed. "Chinese? Yum." Daphne pulled out plastic plates, knives, forks, and 2 serviettes. "I'll set up while you wash your hands." They both looked at the blood caked under Soretta's fingernails. Soretta's smile fell and she nodded before turning to the sink in the corner of the room. When she came back, everything was laid out on the table, and the smell of hot oyster sauce drifted in eddies between them. "Dig in. I've brought enough for both of us. You can debrief while you eat. We didn't have time to talk about the shock you must have had." Soretta's pale brows drew together. "I need to give you money for this." "Not happening." Daphne patted her pocket. "I've got a bill right here for you." She saw Soretta blink, saw the smile peep out again, and felt the warmth expand inside her. Soretta was a good girl. "Okay, I won't try to pay you, but I owe you one," she said with a nod that promised this Outback girl did not forget favours. Ever. "Thank you." "My pleasure. Now, speak." They both sat, And, haltingly, with more pauses at the beginning until it started to come out in a rush, Soretta told of Klaus jumping off the bike with news of the accident and how she'd found her granddad, his face white like the ghost gums that had surrounded him, softly moaning with agony, seeping blood into the red earth. How ghastly it had been, moving him. His groans and gritted teeth. Her glancing at the sky for help. Daphne resisted the impulse to squeeze Soretta's hand. You did well. I know it must have been hard to move him. Normally, it should be avoided, but this time it was the right thing to do, so we could take off again almost straight away. Soretta's eyes stared into a corner of the room, and Daphne knew she was back in the lonely paddock again. That plane landing was all I wanted to see. Waiting is the worst, Daphne said quietly. At least the strain of organising the transfer to the strip gave you something to do while we were coming. Another reason it was a good thing you moved him. Risking paralysis from a spinal injury versus bleeding out with the delay. It had been a hard decision for the young woman, Daphne thought grimly. The young woman shuddered. At one stage, I thought he'd gone. Then I saw his chest move. If you hadn't been as fast as you were, he would have died. Her voice cracked on the last word, and Daphne wondered how many times Soretta had repeated that to herself over the last few hours. He would have died. That was the problem, reliving the fear. You're going to have to let that go and concentrate on the fact that Lachlan didn't die. He's still holding up a bed, so we'll take his tenacity and run with it. She paused to let the words sink in. She needed to reach the panicked centre of Soretta's shocked brain. Will there be anyone at the station when you go home? Do you want to stay with me in town while you visit your granddad in here? She thought about the new doctor and her daughter at the other end of the house. Soretta wouldn't be a bother to anyone. Soretta looked up, her chin set stubbornly. Thanks, Daphne, but once he's stable, I'll go home and come in the afternoons. Get home before dark. There's only Klaus, our backpacker from Germany. I've got the dogs and the horses, and a couple of lambs in the laundry. Of course she would. So the three of you have been running the station? What happened to the other help? Soretta shrugged, philosophical. The Swiss contingent left soon after the satellite dish blew off the roof in the dust storm last month. They'll do without a lot, but they won't do without the internet. It was a big property. Somewhere around 100,000 acres, Rex had said, though to others around here she guessed it was mid-sized. A lot for 3 people. Can you get the dish fixed? She shook her head. Not until it rains. You know the old story. Asset rich, cash poor, and a drought. So Lachlan would be lying in bed here, stressing about the station for the next month or 2. So there's a lot on both your minds. Soretta hesitated. I really need a cash-paying job, but I need to be on the station. Tricky. What can you do? Another shrug. Daphne guessed Soretta was capable of doing anything a man could do. Farm stuff, muster with the quad, maintain the troughs and the pumps, and sort the sheep and cattle. Fence? She grimaced, then brightened. I can do accounts. That's good. Encouragement was all she could offer. Nobody around here had much to add up with the drought going on. Daphne scooped a forkful of noodles into her mouth, and her stomach rumbled. She'd missed lunch, thought briefly of the extra padding around her waist, and mentally shrugged. This was a mercy dash. She had to eat with Soretta, and everyone knew Carbs were more comforting. So, accounts and farm work. But these are all things you need to do at home, too. Soretta nodded glumly. We only need a small cash flow to stop us going backwards and pay for minor expenses. Just for food and a way to attract casual labour until mustering. The last lot of feral goats we mustered brought in enough to pay the bank for this month. Daphne watched her pause for a minute. Then Soretta sighed and shook her head, making a strand of hair fall in her eyes. At the moment, I need my granddad to be able to walk out of this hospital in one piece. Let's start with that one, Daphne agreed. Later they could brainstorm. Between them, they might come up with some solutions. They finished the Chinese food and Daphne cleared away the packaging. Then she reached into her bag and drew something out carefully. I have something small I'd like to share with you. She sat the cupcake with the candle on the scarred coffee table. Although you probably don't feel like it, we still need to celebrate your birthday. Because you are the light in your granddad's life, and without you being here, he wouldn't be. So celebrating your birth is a must. Thank you. Soretta stared for a minute, blinked, and then gave Daphne a watery smile. The next year is going to be your best yet. Soretta raised one disbelieving eyebrow. I'll hold you to that. When Billy let herself into the control centre of Mica Ridge Flying Doctor Service, nobody noticed her for a minute. It felt like the room wasn't big enough to fit her in as well. She'd been sitting dressed at the side of the bed since 5 this morning, ready to go, and now her belly twisted with nerves. How did you approach your dream job come true? Something you'd worked towards for years and always kept at the back of your mind. Her palms felt sweaty, and she wiped them down the side of her trousers as she glanced at her surroundings. There was a circular workstation with a computer screen opposite, and she knew that most retrieval calls came in via the ordinary telephone during the day. Most of those calls would be logged on the computer and fielded by the doctor on duty, and on the days she wasn't flying to an outlying health clinic to provide much-needed chronic care, that would be her. Then it would be her decision in an emergency whether a nurse and pilot would fly out to assist or if the situation required a doctor as well. She knew that most of the time the nurses and pilots were front line and she'd be at the end of the phone. There was no hospital visiting involved, but there was a little consulting room on the base where a doctor could follow up a patient they'd seen at an outlying clinic on a rare occasion when a patient came to town. And, of course, the 2 doctors would take turns to be available if one of the nursing or ancillary staff fell ill. She could manage all that. It was a much smaller base than Broken Hill, which ran differently, with its admin centre, 8 doctors and 16 nursing staff. They only had 2 aircraft at Mica Ridge, and the maintenance was across at the hill. She saw the colour-coordinated daily roster board with the other doctor's name, and there was hers, as well as a column for the flight nurses and for pilots, and any extras for the outreach clinics of the day. Across the room, a group of 4 staff in flight uniform, 3 men and 1 woman, stood talking. Apart from them stood a tall, hulking, black-haired commander in a white shirt with the insignia of the MRFDS. The other doctor and station boss, Morgan Fraser. He filled a whole corner of the cramped room as he stood in front of another computer desk. One look was enough for Billy to see he wore authority so easily it didn't require effort as he spoke firmly into the phone. She switched her attention back to a small, dark-haired woman in the same blue trousers she was in, who split from the group and came across. She looked about Billy's age, maybe a couple of years younger, around 30. For some reason, probably the smile, Billy thought of Pollyanna. "You must be Dr. Green. Lovely to meet you." She gave a wide, genuine grin that touched Billy unexpectedly. The woman held out her hand well before she reached Billy. "I'm Daphne, the nurse manager, but also one of the flight nurses. We missed each other last night." They shook hands briefly. Billy met the friendly brown eyes and felt the unaffected warmth in them. Daphne was one of those people you liked on sight. "Call me Billy." One responsive face was all it took. Her belly settled to a gentle flutter. Daphne said, "I hoped to meet you last night, but we all get used to things cropping up. Did you find everything in the flat?" So Daphne had set things up. "Yeah, all sorted. Thanks for leaving the key. And the milk and bread." She studied her surroundings again. "Have you been up all night?" "On and off. Just came in for a retrieval in the early morning. There's an accident-prone cook out at Pallinup Station, between here and Broken Hill. Accidental Al, we call him. Shot himself with a nail gun trying to knock tin cans off the fence in the dark. Punctured an artery in his leg." She grinned. "That's not something that happens much in the city. Rex and I are going home now for a few hours, but I'll introduce you around first." So Daphne was the motherly type. She was young for that, but there was something about her thoughtfulness that spoke to Billy. She had the feeling Daphne had needed to find big girl britches in the past. Billy had learned to rely on herself too. As the others came across, Daphne said, "We'll have to catch up later." "I'll look forward to it." "This is Rex." There was an extra ta-da in the introduction that she didn't think Daphne actually noticed, and Billy felt her mouth twitch. Rex just smiled. A tall, sandy-haired man, he had tired lines at the sides of his eyes that looked like they would turn into laughter lines if he had enough sleep. He shook her hand calmly. His hand was big and capable, like him, and she warmed to him too. Rex would be a good man to have beside you in an emergency, she decided, just by the look of him. "I'm the senior pilot," he said. "We've exceeded our on-call time. Welcome to the madhouse." She said again, "I'm looking forward to it." It didn't look too mad at the moment, except for the expression on the face of the big guy growling into the phone, taking up emotional space as he continued his phone discussion. He must have sensed her look because he lifted one long finger her way and raised dark eyebrows in acknowledgement, at least. She nodded back before she looked away from him to smile in the general direction of the other two, who began to cross the room towards her. Rex waved and left, and Daphne turned to introduce the newcomers. "This is Hector, the other pilot, and Michael, a flight nurse like me. They'll look after you." "I'm not as pretty as Legs here, but I'm way taller." Michael grinned. He pushed back the mop of dark hair falling over his forehead. "Welcome, Doc." As Billy smiled at Michael's harmless compliment to the nurse, she noticed Daphne wince at the teasing, hesitate, and then shrug and look away. Daphne said to no one in particular, "Well, I'll leave so I can come back. Have a good day." They watched Daphne leave. "Michael's not as easy to get along with as Daphne," Hector murmured. He was mid-height and wiry, like he enjoyed sport and was probably very good at it, blonde and blue-eyed. He grinned at Billy and sized her up. "Hi. Hope you like it here." The vibe was good, professional and genuine, which was a huge bonus on a first day. All the flutters in her belly went to sleep. "We're going to leave you too," Michael said. "Our first clinic starts in an hour and it's 40 minutes flying time." He glanced across the room. Morgan said you're staying on base today to get used to it all? He grinned again. I've bet him $5 you'll get called out. The man called Morgan loomed up beside her, and she suddenly felt as though she was going to start shrinking, like Alice in Wonderland down the rabbit hole as he towered over her. That was weird. She hadn't noticed him move, which said a lot for his agility for such a big guy. It might pay to remember that. She didn't like men who could sneak up on you. Welcome. He held out his hand, and the shake was firm and no nonsense, but for some reason she wanted to check she didn't have a smudge on her nose. He did boss very well. Made her neck prickle. Morgan Fraser, we spoke on the phone. We'll walk out to the aircraft and hangar as the others leave, then cover how the base runs and what we expect of our medical officers. His voice was deep and slow, not drawling, but measured, as if nothing would send him into a real flap. But there was an undercurrent that switched on her warning signals. He had the sort of voice that was viscerally attractive in a macho kind of way. Not suggestive, just sexy, like she'd always imagined phone sex would sound. Not that she'd tried it. Spare me, she reprimanded, and reminded herself she wasn't going to risk allowing men back into her life for at least 2 years. She straightened and wrenched autonomy back from his easy hold. Sure, let's go, she said, as if it was her idea. She couldn't help the tiny spurt of independence that reared its head. She could take orders, but she didn't have to like it. It had been a long time since she'd felt like a schoolgirl, and she wasn't going to start now with Captain Seductive. Morgan raised one eyebrow, and she had the feeling they were at a standoff. Except she sensed he was amused. All right, then, he said, as she followed him outside. As you know, FDS planes never have a patient without a nurse. Ever. The cabin, equipment, satellite phone, etc. is the nurse's responsibility, and when a doctor comes along, they still run the show. We just oversee and make decisions regarding the patient. Billy nodded. At orientation, they talked a lot about cabin safety. Morgan went on, as if she'd disagreed. It's her, or in the case of our male nurses, Michael and Grant, his cabin. And even if there are 2 doctors, which happens sometimes, it's the nurse's responsibility during the flight to make sure the safety briefing is given to all patients, teams, escorts, and so on. They ensure the patient is secured adequately. We have harness-type seatbelts on the stretchers, capsules for bubs, a pedimate to secure a child to the adult stretcher, or the humidicrib for a neonate. The pilot always asks the nurse if everything is all secure prior to takeoff and landing, too. Billy had forgotten to feel annoyed. She looked at the aircraft in front of them and glanced at the blue sky above. When she looked back at Morgan, she nodded again. This was so much bigger than her ego, or even his. Maybe she could get on with this guy after all. She could feel the smile stretch on her face, and he smiled back. He understood. By the time Billy let herself back into the house late that afternoon, she knew she was in the right place. She resisted the urge to hug herself with glee. If Mia's day had panned out okay, then they were laughing. Now that she thought about it, she hadn't spent as much time as she'd thought she would worrying about her daughter, mainly because there was so much going on at the base. Morgan she found challenging, but she'd met challenging men before, although perhaps not quite like him. He ran a tight ship, and apparently he'd been in the army before becoming a doctor, and she guessed that this was a good place to be multi-skilled when lives depended on them all. She'd spent the day rereading the induction manual, taking phone calls from outlying stations, and referring those whom she diagnosed as needing medication. Then there'd been 1 or 2 patients from outlying areas who had seen the doctors at an outreach clinic and were in town for the day, so she'd seen them too. It was like holding her usual surgery, except she couldn't see the patient. As their doctor, Billy could hear their voice and read the corresponding number on the body chart that identified the area of the pain or problem. It was funny how much even inflection in the voice could tell her when it was all she had to rely on. She made sure she confirmed diagnosis and advice with Morgan until she became used to the way he did it. She'd gained the impression Captain Seductive appreciated that. She doubted he'd appreciate her nickname for him, but at least it made her smile. And for these outback families, their pharmacist lived in a box. The medicine chest in the home concept was an excellent system when the logistics of dashing down to the chemist, possibly hundreds of kilometres away, just wasn't on. One person in the household held the keys to the chest and the responsibility for being accountable and replacing stock. This was a necessary precaution when addictive drugs were part of the inventory, and you couldn't have just anybody waltzing in and peering into the lolly shop. Then there was the fact that the accountable person would have to know how to give an injection if needed in an emergency. Station families had many responsibilities that people in towns didn't think about when they could just pop into a hospital or a doctor's surgery or a chemist. Tomorrow she was going on her first outreach clinic. Like most of the FDS services, they flew to towns too small to have doctors or dentists and who relied on the monthly visits provided by the flying doctor. Early diagnosis dramatically improved outcomes for these families. Outback health problems were shifted to the back burner because it was so time-consuming to get advice. This was preventative medicine at its most needed, and tomorrow she'd get started. But that was tomorrow, and Billy unlocked the front door of the grey residence with some trepidation about whether her daughter had enjoyed her own day. Mia bounced into sight, munching on something. "Mum, you're home." Phew, Mia looked okay. "I am. How was school?" Mia's eyes skittered away. "Actually, not too bad." Billy's initial relief was tempered by a suspicious thought. Has she already met a boy? "So the teachers were good and you were happy with your classes?" She received a vague nod and then a small, shy smile. "The people are nice." So she had met a young man. She hoped he was young. It was the older ones you had to watch out for. She wished someone had told her that all those years ago. Billy resisted the urge to put her hands on her hips. "Did you meet any girls?" Mia shrugged. "Of course." Billy gave in. "And what's the interesting new boy's name?" "Trent." She said it quickly, and then she caught the look on her mother's face and blushed. Billy raised her eyebrows. "Trent the gent?" "He's in my year." So Mia knew that her mother was wary of seniors. She must have made her feelings clear at some point. At least Mia seemed to have listened to something she'd said. "How was your day?" Well, this boy sounded better than someone 3 years older, like the hellion in Sydney. And it was nice that Mia had asked about Billy's day. "Interesting." Billy felt her daughter's scrutiny, and there was definitely cheeky humour glinting back at her. Mia tilted her face. "And what's your new man's name?" To her own surprise, she almost said Morgan, and then stopped herself. Instead, she said, "Funny girl. Did you get to meet Daphne today?" Daphne had been banned by Morgan from coming back again for another 12 hours. He'd discovered she'd spent hours at the hospital with one of the patient's daughters, and he'd said she had to sleep. Billy had been privy to that phone conversation and had winced for the kind-hearted woman. Yep, she knocked just after I got home from school. Seems nice. She can cook. I'll show you how well. Mia grinned, waltzed into the tiny kitchen, and lifted the lid on a glass jar of enormous chocolate chip biscuits, lusciously piled on top of each other, and reached in to take another one. That's very sweet of her. How many have you had? Mia grinned. 3. They're great. Stop, then. Billy felt the last of the tension fall from her shoulders. She hadn't seen Mia this friendly for a long time. And her work was worthwhile and exciting, and despite the challenging boss, she couldn't wait until she climbed into that plane tomorrow. This is the end of CD 1. The book continues on CD 2. CD 2. Chapter 3. Daphne had heard the new doctor come home, and she had to stop herself from knocking at the door as soon as Billy would have put her car keys down. "They don't need you barging in like a busybody," she muttered, and winced at the echo of her ex-husband's voice. She'd only wanted to offer food, and anything else she could do to help, after a family next door had suffered a tragedy, but his derision still hurt. She switched the kettle on for another cup of tea she didn't want, to distract herself from the rumble of voices through the wall, and deliberately picked up her iPad to scan the local news. She'd see Dr. Billy at work tomorrow. That would be the best way to start. Give them time to settle in. Daphne scanned the digital news and saw the small column devoted to the farm accident yesterday. Soretta had looked tired this afternoon, and Daphne wished there was something she could do to lighten the girl's load. Make sure she ate a decent meal, for one thing, or offer an ear to listen to her concerns. Soretta's granddad was still heavily sedated from the pain relief he needed, and it wasn't surprising that she was stressed. That wouldn't be helped by being bowed down with the financial responsibility of a floundering property. Maybe she could zip out to the station on her days off, take over the housework so Soretta could concentrate on the farm. It wasn't the first time Daphne had done that. Some of her best weekends since she'd moved to Mica Ridge had been when a station family had all come down with some nasty lurgy, and she'd been dropped off to be nanny, cook, and bottle washer. Had been in her element, cooking up and freezing food, cleaning houses and minding children, until the parents had been able to walk. The hard part of that idea, of course, would be getting it past Soretta, who, like most of the locals around here, was fiercely independent. But Daphne understood that. She hadn't asked for help herself when her world had imploded. A gentle knock sounded at the door, and Daphne jumped. Visitors? She wished. Probably a door knock appeal. She picked up her purse and began counting her change. But when she opened the door, it was the new doctor from next door, and the smile that greeted her warmed the cold loneliness like a ray of afternoon sunlight. "Daphne, hope you don't mind me knocking. Just wanted to say thanks for dropping in on Mia. And the biscuits." Daphne could feel the heat in her cheeks. It was nothing. "You're welcome. She's a lovely girl. She's tall like you." Billy sighed. "The rest of her is totally different. She's a challenge and a joy." There was something there that made Daphne want to comfort the woman, which was stupid. "I'd know her as yours any day. Would you like to come in?" "Thanks. For a minute?" Daphne gestured Billy to one of the lounge chairs, and watched her sink gracefully into it. Daphne had never mastered being graceful, and she tried not to be envious of the other woman's social ease. She saw her glance around. "Your flat is lovely." Daphne appraised the room. It was better than it was originally. For a plain box of a flat, she'd made it homey. She'd always been able to create ambience with furnishings. It was her inability to satisfy fathers and husbands and create the family she'd so desperately wanted that she had trouble with. "I try." She pushed thoughts of herself away. "So, how was your first day?" "Fine." The word held a world of relief. "Everyone does a great job out here." Daphne felt the pride expand in her chest. There were other types of family, and she was finding them in her work. It seemed Billy felt it, too. She nodded happily. "I'm glad you think so. What made you come out here to work?" Billy hesitated. "I've had the dream for a while. I used to live here as a little girl before my parents died. Was always going to come back. It just took longer than I anticipated." Daphne wanted to ask, "How old were you when they died? Who looked after you?" but held herself in, just chewed her lip instead before she said, "Well, we're glad to see you now." She saw Billy visibly relax because she hadn't asked nosy questions. Maybe she was learning to step back after all. Billy asked, "And how long have you been here?" 6 months. I came from Canberra, grew up in the suburbs. My father was a politician, and so was my ex-husband." It was now Daphne's turn to dread the questions that would come, but she guessed it was best to get them out of the way. Like the sting of lancing a boil. Just what she needed. Yuck. Except she didn't have to. Billy smiled, almost as if she knew the story, which was silly. Nobody knew the story. "I'm glad you moved here for my sake, too, then." They smiled at each other, and what awkward tension was left seeped away. The next morning at the base, Morgan was the first person Billy saw when she opened the door. He looked ridiculously athletic, and she wondered if she needed to think about joining a gym or something. Her inappropriate half scanned the taut thighs in beige trousers and tight shirt sleeves and decided he was more like one of those guys who hung out of a helicopter by his feet and scooped you up from a sinking ship. He really didn't look like any of the doctors she knew. That sneaky ember she'd warned herself about glowed in her belly, and she doused it with a cup of common sense. "Morning." She'd almost said Captain, but she bit her lip to hold back the smile as he raised those black and moody eyebrows. So the man wasn't slow. She'd thought she'd hidden her amusement well. "Something entertains you?" "Well, obviously. Just glad to be here, boss." "Passed the first test, then," he said, with an easy smile that startled her, and which was way harder to ignore. Then he turned back to the large schedule board that stood on the easel in the corner of the room. "Let's see where we'll send you today." There was no guesswork involved. The roster was made for the month, with clinics and delegations and teams. She'd already seen he was the type who had everything planned and allocated before he'd leave the previous day, and as she followed his silent stride across the room, the flutter of anticipation skittered across her belly. Today, she'd fly, could put all the flight physiology she'd learned into practice, have her first glimpse of the browns and oranges of the landscape below from her aerial vantage point. she'd meet her first outback community as they dropped off the other health workers and flew on to their own clinic. "I'll send you with Daphne on the last drop. She's replacing one of the clinic nurses today, who's off sick. Generally, she does retrievals. You'll do the chronic GP clinic while she runs the immunisation and antenatal checks. Burenji is one of our furthest clinics. Start you off easy." She narrowed her eyes, lifted her head, prepared to say she didn't want easy, when she saw his smile. Morgan was way ahead of her. There was another unexpected twinkle in his eye that disappeared quickly. "Don't worry, there is no easy. They're all unique challenges. I imagine the hardest part will be prizing Daphne away at the end of the clinic. She does tend to want to mother everyone." Billy could see that. She's a treasure. No such flowery stuff for Morgan. She's an excellent clinician. Then they both glanced towards the door as Daphne entered, juggling a big plate of biscuits and 2 hot coffees in her hands. "Morning, Morgan. Morning, Billy." The health clinic at Burenji was held in a converted shipping container with a high corrugated iron roof built above it to allow the hot, still air to breathe around the box. The air conditioner hummed energetically in the middle between the 2 consulting room ends and puffed cooler air towards the exterior doors, where it was sucked out and beaten into submission by the heat outside. Daphne helped Billy settle into her GP clinic, which held a tiny desk, 2 chairs, and a fold-up examination bed, similar to those carried by masseurs for home visits. There was enough equipment to achieve rudimentary examinations, plus a handheld iStat machine for quick blood tests. But she thought perhaps the communication of medical history might prove problematic with the heavy dialect of the local people, so different to Billy's experience. Outside the structure, standing and sitting under a tree, were a dozen candidates for the doctor. 2 younger station women with their children for Daphne herself, who'd brought folding chairs with them, an old jackaroo with bow legs and a chest infection, and 2 Aboriginal elders sitting on haunches against the backdrop of desert. All were good-naturedly waiting their turn or being nudged to the head of the line for various reasons. On Daphne's end of the container, it was immunisation day, and children clutched their mothers' hands or necks and buried their faces when Daphne called the next victim through for a weigh on the portable scales, an immunisation needle, and finally a juicy mandarine from the bag she'd stowed in the plane that morning for rewards. Barbara Tompkins' daughter, Gwyn, was here for her 4-year-old injections. Barbara's family had been one of the ones Daphne had dropped in to nurture when they all came down with chickenpox. Gwyn was happy to see Daphne, and she didn't even cry when the 2nd injection went in. "Auntie Daphne will need to come and have a fun visit one day, won't she, Gwyn? And we won't let her lift a finger." "No fun in that, Barb." Daphne smiled at the mum and the stoic child, whose huge dark eyes were glued to Daphne as she clutched her mandarine. Daphne opened the door to let them out. The next patient was ushered to the front of the line outside Daphne's door by a determined older lady. One look at the younger woman as she grimaced and dropped her hand to her big belly, and Daphne smiled. She tried not to be too excited that she'd have the chance to do a bit of midwifery for a change. Not too much, but a little would be very nice. "Come in. Sit down." The young woman sidled past, eyes down, chewing her lip, but she didn't sit. Too uncomfortable, maybe? Daphne smiled at the older lady. "Are you her mum?" "Auntie May. This is Belle. She's too early. Didn't want to come, but I made her." Maybe 6 weeks, Daphne thought, and glanced again at the noticeable but not huge pregnant belly. Lucky you did, I'm thinking. When is your baby due, Belle? End of next month. Auntie May nodded, and the clinic chair groaned in protest as she lowered her bottom onto it and crossed her arms in front of her ample bosom. She'd effectively blocked the door, and Belle wasn't going anywhere. So, 6 weeks early, Daphne glanced at the bed and wondered how she'd get Belle up there so she could feel her belly, find out the baby's position, because if it was early, it could quite possibly be breech. Belle groaned. Are you in labour, Belle? Silly question. Another contraction caused a small moue of distress. Yep. They'd have to fly her out. ASAP. The girl raised wild eyes to Daphne. Gotta push. Daphne straightened. This was a whole new ballgame. She recognised the look and so didn't need to ask if she was sure. Well then, her voice gentled even more. Don't be scared. The girl's eyes skittered to her auntie's. Gotta push. Now. Daphne stepped to her left and opened the communication door between the 2 consulting rooms, poked her head in. Looks like we're having a baby in here, Doctor. About 34 weeks. Without waiting for an answer, Daphne turned and grabbed a pair of gloves and the only 2 towels she had within reach. She put one on the floor in front of Belle and slung one over her shoulder so she could use it to wipe the baby when she needed to. Do you want to lie down? Daphne inclined her head to the bed, and Belle shook her head vehemently just as Billy opened the door. Without turning her head, Daphne said, Can you turn off the air conditioner, please? Prem baby. And then, Did you want to do this, Doctor? I'll watch and help if I'm needed. The syntocinin's in the emergency box in the fridge. You could draw that up. Having the injection ready for after the birth would be good. They didn't need the mother to have a bleed as well. Daphne shot Billy a reassuring smile before she returned her attention to the girl. Why don't you lean on the back of this chair, Belle, and just do what feels right? It's okay. Belle gasped, then shook her head at the sensations that were building. Daphne put her hand very gently on Belle's shoulder, smiled at her. Her voice was just above a whisper and very calm. It's okay. Let me help get your knickers off and you can have your baby. If we have time, I'd really like to try to listen to your baby's heartbeat. But when she looked into Belle's face, she saw that there was no time for anything. She was pushing. They'd probably be listening to this baby's heartbeat on the outside. A sudden gush of water splashed the floor between the girl's legs, mostly caught by the strategic towel, and Belle jumped at the sensation. Daphne glanced quickly at the colour of the liquid and met Billy's eyes in relief, because the water pooling on the towel and floor was, reassuringly, faintly pink. Billy nodded. They were both happy the baby hadn't passed a meconium stool before birth, because there was more chance of respiratory problems after birth if the amniotic fluid was green with meconium. The girl planted her hands on the back of the chair, sank slowly to her haunches above the wet towel, closed her eyes, and squeezed with a low, growling moan that meant business. And then it happened. Daphne hurriedly crouched too, gloved hands waiting under the other draped towel, and almost missed the catch because the baby shot out so fast, but she deftly gathered the tiny, wizened body as it tumbled into the towel on the end of a snaking purple umbilical cord. Well caught, Billy murmured. Daphne smiled to herself as she rubbed the thick protective coating of white Vernex from a little screwed-up face so the sticky eyes could blink slowly, as if still unsure what the heck had just happened. Then finally he opened his mouth and made a scratchy, mewling cry that slowly strengthened into an indignant protest. Good, said the quiet, satisfied voice of Auntie May from the corner of the room. I hear you guys had an exciting day. Daphne had been called out on another retrieval, this time to a man with chest pain, after they'd come back from the emergency flight with Belle and her baby. Billy was checking up on blood results from some of the patients she'd seen today. Morgan had finished what he'd been doing at his desk and crossed the room to her workspace to lean against the wall. Billy looked up and up at him. She wished he wouldn't tower over her because it made it hard to concentrate. She resisted the urge to stand as well, but it might have shown in her face because he put one big arm out and lifted a chair as if it was a box of matches and sat it across from her desk. Sat into it, lounged back, and studied her. At least it wasn't so crowded when he sat down. What had he said? Exciting day. She thought about the tiny, mewling baby and the surprised mum and couldn't help the smile that flooded her face. It warmed her heart. Very. It all happened pretty fast. I was still looking around for cord clamps, but had no idea where they were. Her brow creased. Daphne didn't seem in a hurry to cut the cord. He nodded. Good. A lot of mums are anemic out here, and baby gets extra red blood cells from the placenta if you don't rush to cut the cord. Waiting for it to stop pulsating is a good thing. There's an interesting research paper with evidence that the blood flows back and forth until the newborn's body shuts it down at just the right moment. She might have read that somewhere. Boy, did she need to brush up on the latest obstetric trends. She'd spent most of her pre-start time on snake bites and chest pains. How much extra? Anything from 70 to 150 mils of blood. Makes a huge difference to childhood anemia, and it's especially good if a baby is 6 weeks premature, like Anthony was. The baby boy's inquisitive eyes appeared in her mind, and she smiled again. I can't believe how alert he was. He did so well on the flight coming in. He ignored that. Instead, he was piercing her with his black eyes as if he'd found a fault he wouldn't tolerate. She was distracted for a second. A man's eyes couldn't be black. They must be the darkest brown. Whoa there, stop it. She blinked herself back to the real world, and he went on. You don't sound as confident with neonates as I expected. You said you had your obstetric diploma. Just the experience in maternity. I did that in a semi-rural hospital. It was more antenatal bloods and occasional cesareans than actual high-risk birthing practice. The paediatric registrar did the babies, but they were mostly low risk. You must have had some babies that needed resuscitation. Sure, but any really sick babies were shipped out, and apart from the required number of normal births, I was mostly dealing with the paperwork and getting the lay of the land. It was fun, but there wasn't quite enough experience, even though what was there was good. After that, I went on and did ophthalmology for 3 months. He lifted his head at that. The eyes have it, he quipped. That'll be handy. It requires vision, she said, tongue-in-cheek. He gave her one of those real smiles, and somewhere down in the pit of her stomach, that tiny coal of long slumbering heat flickered again. No. She turned her head away, mentally pinched out the flames like the smouldering wick of a candle. Anyway, I better get this report done, or I'll be off late, and my daughter will be home. That was the idea. No men until Mia was safely at university. He sat back and studied her, with leisurely thoroughness. a confident, meticulous assessment that warmed her belly again even while it raised her hackles. "Your daughter's name is Mia?" She couldn't think of one work-related reason he'd needed to remember that. Mia's age could impact on Billy's work. Mia's health or behaviour maybe, but not her daughter's name. So it was a personal question, and she hadn't expected anything personal from Morgan. He gave off that work is for work vibe, and she'd thought it was only her who'd found the other person distracting. "Yes, that's right. Daphne met her yesterday with cookies." He stood up. Daphne's cookies. They'd go over well. A tough act to follow. Then he walked away, and she felt vaguely unsettled. When she was ready to leave, Billy drove home via a different route, one that took her up towards the houses nearer the ridge that looked over the town, to where her parents had had their neat 3-bedroom bungalow with the big tree that somehow didn't seem so big now that she was a grown woman. She sat outside in her car and stared at the house she'd lived in with her parents. Obviously, a young family had moved in. A scooter lay on its side outside the front door on the path, and there was a new shiny plastic swing on the tree she could remember having an old rope and tire on. The memories were all good, and the unsettled feeling Morgan had left her with disappeared, and in its place was a sense of homecoming, belonging, and finally, some peace. Coming back here, with Mia, this was not just another new town. This was where she would settle. In central Mica Ridge, in the Hair for You beauty salon, Lorna Lamerton put the new donation tin for the Silver City Flying Doctor Service on the edge of the shelf. Then she straightened the black plastic hairdresser's shawl back into place. "What have I missed this week?" The young Cockney stylist straightened Lorna's head and met her eyes in the mirror. "They say there's another new doctor at the Flying Doctor base." She flicked her chin in the direction of the tin. "We all know you're interested in what goes on there." A new doctor? A pang of too familiar grief for her husband stung until she shook it off. They'd been lucky for all the wonderful years they'd had. Not so lucky with the downward spiral of Alzheimer's in the last 2. She let the breath sticking in her prickling throat ease out carefully. Lorna concentrated on the news. "Male or female?" "Female. As a teenage daughter, I hear. Grew up in Mica Ridge, but left years ago when her parents were killed. Apparently, they were school teachers." Lorna straightened. Green. The name sprang into her mind with startling clarity. The past always did. It was the present that got somewhat muddled. She remembered a lovely couple, both of whom taught at the primary school, and they had one sweet daughter. The town had been devastated. Her husband had been very upset because the ambulance had picked him up on the way to the accident, but there'd been nothing he could do. Too little, too late. The girl had gone to a relative in the city. Lorna did love to catch up on the local news, and nowadays that only happened at the yearly Christmas cake fundraiser for the RFDS, or at the hairdressers. She so enjoyed having her hair washed and set. It was the best part of her week since she'd lost her husband. She missed years of chatting, hearing about people's lives at the surgery, and being the person people turned to. Being useful. When dear Wallace had passed on, she hadn't had the energy for her old life, because she'd been so exhausted from caring for him until the end. Then that woman had married her son and moved in to look after her. Humph. All she'd needed was a good sleep for a month, and she would have been fine. Mentally, she snorted. Now, she wasn't encouraged to invite people to drop in. And she missed the interaction she'd had as the doctor's wife. Lorna was beginning to feel something she'd never felt before. Old and useless. And she didn't like it one bit. She dragged her mind back to the conversation. Always good to have a new doctor? Can you remember her first name? No, sorry, don't know her name. The girl pulled back a new part line to touch up the roots. Lorna would miss this dear girl when she moved on. Like most of these young adventurers, she'd hear of a new town to visit and set her sights on a new quest. Backpack away. Lorna wished she could do that. Just disappear. She wished she could move out to one of those one-horse towns and be the nurse again. Like she'd been 50 years ago when she'd met her husband. Doing something worthwhile, constantly alert for the next crisis. Dealing with the impossible until help arrived. Riding through storms on horseback to help deliver a baby or splint a bone. She'd done some exhilarating things in her time. Maybe she could go somewhere really remote. She wasn't young, but she'd be better than no resources. Who was she kidding? She was too old now, only able to raise pitiful sums of money to help the local flying doctor base. Too old to be employed, too old to be a help rather than a hindrance. And wasn't that drummed into her every day? In the nicest possible way. Humph. She'd always said she wasn't going to be one of those grannies who minded the grandchildren and tidied the house. But she would have eaten those words these last 2 years if she'd had the chance. And with her son's wife apparently putting motherhood off until Lorna was dead, she had no choice anyway. Lorna? The young girl paused as she painted the purple dye along the silver roots. You okay there? I'm fine, dear. Silly old fool she was. Just wool gathering. Wool gathering? The hairdresser tilted her head and glanced again at Lorna in the mirror. Smiled that genuinely interested smile. And what would that be? Wool gathering? A lovely phrase. Diverted, Lorna explained. When the sheep brush along the fences, little tufts of wool get caught on the wire, and on tree branches and sharp rocks, like the boulders we have on the ridge out of town. If you were to go along and collect these, you'd be wool gathering. The girl nodded with keen attention. Someone told me yesterday there were 2 million sheep along the Darlin. For a shallow brown river, that's a lot of livestock. True, though there's less now with the drought. Lorna thought about it, and a picture with wool-studded fences floated into her mind. Imagine all the tiny bits of fluff caught up with twigs and leaves. She smiled, accepting her own foibles. And it's like my mind, collecting little thoughts and things that stick in my brain and come out in a clump for me to unravel. You do more of it as you get older, probably because of all the trails old people have travelled. As long as she kept her wits, unlike poor Wallace. The girl shook her head vehemently. You're not old. Lorna snorted. I'm 80 next week. So, what are you doing for your 80th, Lorna? The spiky-haired young backpacker leant down to add in her drawling Liverpool accent. Something naughty, I'll bet. You're the youngest 80-year-old I know. There's a wild life in you yet. Run away with a younger man and have your wicked way with him. Lorna spluttered and laughed. It wasn't even patronising, like her daughter-in-law would have been if she'd said something similar. It was genuine, encouraging, warm, like the young woman who'd said it. Don't know about the wicked way. Lorna was too old to blush, but she grinned roguishly. But you're sweet. Lorna wondered, was bumped gently out of her resignation. Not about the sex. Lord, no. But was she too old to run away from home? Chapter 4. A week after they'd arrived, Mia Green decided that moving out of Sydney may not have been the worst thing that had happened to her. Her new friend, Trent, had a motorbike, and her first glimpse of the out-of-town dirt racing track was the most exciting place Mia had ever seen. They'd come straight from school, ducking into the back garage at Trent's house and wheeling the motorbike up the street so his mum didn't hear it start up. Both riders underage, an unregistered bike, and a quick blat through the back streets until they hit a dirt track was just the sort of clandestine adventure Mia loved. She knew who wouldn't like it, but what her mother didn't know wouldn't hurt her, and Mum didn't finish work until 5. That gave Mia 90 minutes to get from school to home, and a lot of fun could be had in 90 minutes. Can I try steering? They'd stopped after 15 minutes of going around and around the rough bush track, skirting straggly gum trees, leaning precariously around rocky outcrops until she'd laughed out loud, and finally rolling to a stop under a spotted gum to take off their helmets. Trent checked his watch. It's pretty powerful. He shook his head. Maybe tomorrow. Just a quick go, Mia wheedled. He frowned at her. Have you ridden a bike before on your own? She was tempted to lie, but decided against it. Just as a passenger. He shook his head decisively. It's getting late. We'll see tomorrow. Trent was firm, and Mia actually didn't mind that. There was something pretty cool about a guy she couldn't manipulate easily. A challenge. She smiled to herself. But she'd get her way. Trent dropped her off at the end of her street in case her mother was home early, and they went their separate ways. She felt like skipping, except she was far too mature for that. Mia passed the white house with the gabled roof that she'd decided was her favourite and waved to the old lady with purple hair sitting on the front veranda. Lots of people at her school in Sydney had purple hair, but not old people. She glanced again at the lady and couldn't imagine ever being that old. Her world was pretty darned good, actually. She wondered if her mother would buy her a bike if she asked. Her mood flattened. Doubt it. That would be considered too dangerous. The downside of having a doctor for a mother. Or one of them. She turned into the front path and almost ran into Daphne coming the other way. Stinker. Hello, Mia. Daphne caught the flare of dismay in Mia's eyes and thought, where have you been? Billy's daughter quickly lowered her lashes, and Daphne wondered if her mother knew Mia wasn't coming straight back from school. Hi, Daphne. You going out? The tone was nonchalant, and Daphne suppressed a smile. Little minx. She'd sounded totally unconcerned, as if the thought that Daphne might mention it to her mother never crossed her mind. She wouldn't, unless she was asked. Her shift started at 7 a.m. and finished at 3:30 p.m. Billy ran on the doctor's roster, left and finished an hour and a half later. so wouldn't be home until 5 p.m. Daphne put aside her concerns, but she didn't put them away. She'd keep an eye out. She changed the subject. I'm visiting a young friend. Her granddad had a station accident, and she comes in to visit in the afternoons. That way she gets home before the roos get too thick on the highway. She saw the girl nod. A flash of compassion crossed her face, and Daphne was pleased to see that Mia had her mother's empathy. Hope her granddad feels better. See you then. She waved. Daphne watched her turn and hurry up the path to the side door. Probably wanted to wash the red dust off the back of her legs and uniform before her mum came home. Daphne wondered what young Mia had been doing and hoped it wasn't something Billy would hate too much. She turned onto the footpath and strode along the street towards the hospital. She imagined it would be challenging to have a teenage daughter and realised Billy must have been very young when Mia was born. She was probably used to challenges. Daphne would have loved a daughter. A family of any kind. It had always been her dream, but she was getting to the stage where it looked less likely. In fact, sometimes it felt totally impossible, given she was 30 and there was no man on the horizon except her doomed attraction to Rex. The problem was she didn't fancy anyone else, and Rex liked to tease her, but didn't think of her in that way. She saw Lorna Lamington sitting on the veranda and remembered that all families had their moments. She'd met her at one of the RFDS fundraising meetings, and Lorna had invited her to the annual Christmas pudding-making week coming up. She was really looking forward to that. The older lady seemed to be spending more time sitting on the veranda these days. Daphne had dropped in a week ago, and they'd had a cup of tea overlooking the street, talking about the time Lorna had been a nurse all those years ago. Fascinating stuff. Daphne had the impression Lorna didn't see eye to eye with her new daughter-in-law, though she hadn't said as much. Daphne waved, and Lorna waved back. That woman had a few tales to tell. Daphne made a mental note to drop in again one day soon, because the company suited them both. When Billy arrived home, Mia was already showered, and a load of washing was in the machine. Impulsively, she hugged her daughter. Life was pretty darn good. I'm so pleased we've moved here. You were never this organised in Sydney. Mia blushed. I'm getting older. That you are. Billy couldn't help sharing her excitement. We delivered a baby today, out in a tin shed in the middle of nowhere. As she said it, she corrected herself. We were there when a baby was born. Daphne was right. They hadn't delivered a baby. Belle had done all the work. Mia looked up. Wow, that's pretty cool. Can I tell, a slight hesitation, the kids at school tomorrow? Or one kid? One particular male kid? Sorry, probably not. Patient confidentiality. Mia turned away. Okay. She turned back. What was it like? Watching a baby be born? It must be gross. Billy laughed, remembering. It was different to any delivery she'd seen in the past. Quick. Slightly scary, if I started to think what would happen if the baby didn't cry. But he did, and was fine. So then it was just amazing. Not gross at all. She tilted her head at her daughter, who seemed to be glowing and happy and more animated than she'd been for months. I didn't think gross when you were born. Mia looked at her. Thanks, Mum. It was a look she hadn't seen on her daughter's face before. What for? An honest answer? I try to be honest with you all the time, Mia, and I hope you'd want to be honest with me. Sure. There was a pause. Can I have a motorbike? No. Mia shook her head in disgust. That was brutally honest. Billy ran her fingers through her hair. Okay, maybe that had been a reflex bark. We live in town. Maybe if we had some land around us. Mia rolled her eyes. Well, that's not going to happen. It might. Did something happen at school today? Nope. Nothing ever happens. Then she turned away and walked into her room. Billy sank down on a chair. What had all that been about? How had she handled that so badly they'd ended up not talking? Billy thought with a tinge of unease that maybe she was missing something, and then sighed. She was tired. It had been a big day. She remembered during her aeromedical training, they'd mentioned how fatigue could sneak up on you until you became accustomed to the different pressures of the aircraft. It had been interesting to be reminded about the added stresses of air travel on patients and staff alike. Today had been a hot one, and the aircraft had taken a while to cool down after they took off. They'd had to monitor Anthony's temperature. Not too hot, and certainly not cold. It was also different to road ambulance transport. There were medical adjustments you didn't normally think about. Having to fly lower for head and abdominal injuries, managing the extreme heat in the cabin until the air conditioner kicked in after takeoff, and working with headphones constantly, even while carrying on a conversation with the patient. And the rubbery legs sometimes when you climbed down from the plane. She could see how it could be physically demanding to edge around the patient, accessing equipment and IV lines, and monitoring equipment, all the while in the air. Especially if the patient's condition deteriorated. Hence the reason to be well set up before the plane left the ground. Daphne did it all the time. Had done most of the organising today. Billy was beginning to think she was lucky the doctors only went out when more help was needed, or to clinics. She thought about today's baby, and her spirits lifted. Boy, she loved this. The unpredictability of it, the genuine need and appreciation of their patients for the service they offered. This was what she wanted to do, and the people were great. Daphne was great. Her thoughts drifted back to Morgan. How on earth did his shoulders fit in the aircraft? Billy grimaced. She didn't need to complicate it all by having a stupid attraction to her boss. But it was a long-forgotten feeling to suspect she was admired as a woman and not just a doctor. Was she so wrong to want to bask in it for a change? As long as she stayed in control, it was fine. I'm sorry, honey, but I've asked the real estate agent to come out and value Blue Hills. I think we should sell. Looking at her grandfather as he lay in his hospital bed, Soretta didn't know what to do. Her brain felt so full of words that she wanted to cry. There were so many thoughts she needed to clarify, but the impending disaster and loss of what was, for her, heartland, was swirling so thickly in the shock of the moment, she couldn't make her mouth work. That her grandfather was putting their home on the market after 4 generations in their family sat like a lump in her throat, and a thick black coat of hopelessness settled around her shoulders. She wasn't used to feeling like this, vulnerable. She'd never been in a situation where she couldn't fight her way out. Even those first 3 months at boarding school, when the last thing she'd wanted to do was to live 500 miles away from her home, she'd accepted that it was what her grandparents judged was the best thing for her. So she'd gone, as asked, refused to let it get her down, when Year 7 girls all around her had cried with homesickness and despair, had concentrated on working hard and building her agricultural and business skills to make her grandparents proud. She'd hidden the homesickness that never really went away and put in the structured hours of homework the school had mapped out, while the other girls had slipped out and made mischief and caused mayhem in the boys' school across the road. Thankfully, she'd flown back to Mica Ridge in the holidays and thrown on her jeans and boots and headed out into the paddocks as fast as she could. God, she'd loved getting home for holidays. She'd missed her horses, missed her dogs, missed the sunrise out in the paddock before the heat and mustering, fixing fences, kicking around in the old Land Rover. But it had all worked out well, because she'd taken over the business accounts and tried to stay on top of the latest agricultural trends after her gran had died. Yes, at the moment they had a drought, but there were always droughts. Yes, there was only her and Grandad, but she'd thought they were doing okay. Or would be, as soon as the rain came. The wild goat harvest had been good. Her sheep were healthy. She didn't ask for much, didn't need anything she didn't have, just wanted to keep the life that she and her Grandad loved. And she had no idea what she would do if they sold. "Oh, Grandad," was all she could say. By the time Daphne arrived at the hospital, only slightly puffed from the long walk, her roaming thoughts were interrupted by the sight of Soretta, ahead along the corridor, despair in every line of her body. Soretta was known for greeting the world eye to eye. The young woman's back was facing her as she leant the side of her head against the corridor wall, shoulders bowed, and Daphne's stomach dropped. "Not Lachlan," she prayed, and hurried forward. "You okay, Soretta?" She spoke quietly. She put her hand gently on Soretta's shoulder, and the young woman lifted her head. Her eyes were weary, but not damp. "Daphne, hi. I'm fine." She looked anything but fine until she pulled herself back to a normal facade. "Your Grandad okay?" "Physically, you mean?" Soretta gave a half-strangled laugh. "The doctor says he's slowly healing, but it's going to take at least weeks in here, if not months." Daphne had suspected that would be the case. "How are you managing out at the station?" "I'm doing good." Her tone was all defiance. "But apparently not good enough to stop Grandad thinking we need to sell." Daphne could see the hurt in her eyes. "Did he say that today, when you arrived?" "It was the first thing he said. If the rain came, he'd be fine. We could sell some lambs for a decent price and start the cash flowing again. But we're scraping the bottom of the barrel now. I don't have enough to pay Klaus. Grandad's decided we'll lose all the sheep in the station anyway, so we may as well sell now." Daphne tried to lift her spirits. "He's probably worried about you working too hard." Soretta shook her head despairingly. "He's never worried before." "Sure he has. He's just been there to make sure you didn't overdo it. Now he can't physically be there. It'd be hard for a man like your Grandad to watch his granddaughter do his work." She saw Soretta consider that and take it on board. She looked even less happy. "I guess." Daphne didn't know what to say. What can I do to help? Soretta shook her head at the magnitude of the problem. You do enough just by coming to visit. She glanced around at the grey hospital corridor, at Daphne. I don't know why you bother to come after a day of flying all over the country in a hot aircraft. Daphne saw the look Soretta gave her. No doubt her hair had slipped into bad hair day hours ago. It had been uncomfortable today, but she was used to it now. I know you've had a huge day at work already. I heard the nurses say you brought in a premature baby today. You're marvellous. Daphne could feel the heat in her cheeks, and she brushed the compliment away. I'm just one of the team. Everyone does a good job. She paused, changed the subject back to where she wanted it. But I'd like to be on your team, too. There was a pause. When Soretta didn't answer, she tried again. So, cash is the problem? And a little would help? Soretta's head jerked up. I'm not borrowing money. Daphne smiled. Of course she wouldn't. I wouldn't offend you by offering. Though, maybe she could just move out to the station and offer the rent she was paying here to Soretta. I was wondering if you'd thought about renting out part of the homestead, even if you were looking for people like me. I'd love to live on a station instead of in town. You could put all those extra rooms to good use, like a boarding house. Daphne had thought of this yesterday. A boarding house? Soretta stared, and Daphne felt like saying, It's not that mad an idea. Then Soretta said, Why on earth would anyone want to do that? Why would you? She wanted to help, loved helping. But she also wanted to experience for herself what it was like to live on a station. I've been lonely, she told Soretta, and I've always wanted to live on the land. That's why I came out here in the first place. You're alone, and we get on well. I wouldn't bother you, and it could work for both of us. Think about it. The money might be enough to at least pay the backpackers' wages and stop you slipping further into debt. It might even buy you time with your grandfather because you wouldn't be alone out there. That's probably part of the problem for him. Daphne saw the flare of hope rise and then die in Soretta's eyes. Except I couldn't let you pay anything. You've already been so good to me. Daphne shook her head. I pay rent where I am now, and it's a dingy, dreary place to live. She thought of Billy's dilemma, about Mia's lack of supervision after school. The doctors had their rent paid, but Billy might still think it was a good idea. Mia might even be safer on a property. Maybe even the new doctor and her daughter would like to come. Imagine if you had 3 boarder rents coming in. She'd actually run the idea of living out of town past Morgan yesterday, and he'd raised his eyebrows, commented on her strange ability to seek out lame ducks, and the fact that the wildlife could be a problem if she was driving in dim light. But reluctantly, he'd agreed that it was on the perimeter of permissible. While the homestead itself was not far out of town, the station boundaries stretched back to the South Australian border for another 100 kilometres, so the house was just close enough on this boundary. After hours, she needed to be on base within 20 minutes, so they were ready to fly 40 minutes after the call came in, though often the pilots had the aircraft ready sooner. The homestead is under the limit allowed, so I can still do on-call from there. It's a nice idea. Soretta ran her fingers through her hair slowly as she thought. But Grandad would never agree. If he didn't, then of course that's it. They were both silent until Daphne said, "But, I'd almost be away more than in." She thought about on-call again. Realistically, call-outs happened a couple of times every week. If it did look possible, would it disturb you if I come in and out some nights? Soretta frowned. Of course not. The spare bedrooms are at the other end of the house from ours. Soretta glanced down the corridor towards the room where her grandfather lay, her gaze troubled. I'll ask him. At least it's something different to talk about. He's asleep at the moment. Then I'll go and you think about it, but only if it seems like a good idea. She waved the brown paper bag she held. Can I leave these savoury muffins with you? Soretta laughed. Take them off your hands, you mean? Because they're being a nuisance in your house? Daphne was pleased to see a different face to the one she'd witnessed when she'd first arrived, and she felt her heart expand with relief. She so admired Soretta. Soretta never complained, but it wasn't much of a life for a young woman running a station single-handedly. It was a big job for anyone, and knowing now that it could be in vain must be soul-destroying. Just maybe another person's company around the house would help as much as the little cash it would bring in. She hoped Lachlan saw that. If he didn't, she might just have to visit one day when his granddaughter wasn't here and help him see it. This is the end of CD 2. The book continues on CD 3. CD 3. Chapter 5. It sounds like a perfect solution, Daphne. Lorna was sitting forward in her chair with the Royal Dalton teapot suspended in the air. Daphne had called in after the hospital because Lorna had still been sitting on the veranda when she'd walked back past. Lorna sighed. That poor girl. Her hand started to shake with the weight of the pot, and she grimaced in annoyance before putting it down. Daphne didn't comment. I think the no-frills station lifestyle could be fun, Lorna. I've never lived on the land, and apparently the homestead is quite large. It'd be a nice change from town. Lorna nodded enthusiastically. I remember the homestead. It's huge, almost like the lodging houses we used to have in my day. Originally, there were 2 families living there, and after a couple of really bumper years, they added a lot of rooms. If she could get a few $100 a week, it could make all the difference. And you say the new doctor and her daughter might be interested? Lorna took a delicate bite of her scone. I envy you all. I haven't actually broached the subject with Dr. Green yet, but maybe it could work out well for her too. Maybe not, Daphne said, but I'm going out the day after tomorrow to talk to Soretta, have a look, and see if it could work. I'll go before lunch, before Soretta comes into the hospital to see her granddad. Lorna sniffed. I always said that duplex you're in now was too pokey for staff. Our flight nurses and doctors deserve better. Lorna put her cup down. When you go, she hesitated, and Daphne tilted her head to pay attention. I don't suppose I could come for the drive with you? Get out of the house? Daphne's mouth twitched. They both loved company. I'll mention it to Soretta, and I'm sure you could. Nice for me, too, to have someone to drive out with. Lorna sat back with a happy sigh. You're very kind. I haven't been out to Blue Hill Station since Lachlan's wife went into labour with Soretta's father nearly 50 years ago. Daphne laughed. She could just picture Lorna arriving with a bag at the homestead, ready to help. I keep forgetting you know these places so much better than I do. Lorna smiled with the happy memories. A lot has changed since my day, not least being able to get into a car as comfortable as yours and arrive in less than 15 minutes. She grinned. You know, my husband's old black saloon is still in the garage out the back. I keep threatening to polish it up and go for my driver's license again. I won't let them sell it. Lorna sat back with a reminiscing gleam in her eye. But in those days, it was horses. I rode the most cantankerous horse that day. The darn thing knew only 2 speeds, flat out or dawdle. It took me 2 hours to gee it up out there. Daphne laughed and shook her head. I'll remember that when I think about complaining about the heat in the parked aircraft next time we take off. 2 days later, Daphne, with Lorna beside her in the passenger seat, drove the 9 kilometres of tarred road to Blue Hills, with purple's Patterson's Curse and yellow native bushes that were in flower at the side of the road. Daphne thought it looked like native jasmine, very pretty, but it was probably a weed, like Mr. Patterson's bush. The heat haze shimmered in the distance. Trees seemed suspended in air above the earth in the gap where the mirage lay on the horizon. Look at that emu, Lorna, Daphne said. He's totally unconcerned by the heat. He's just munching at the side of the road. Smart Alec. Cheeky blighters, emus. Lorna scanned the paddocks. I always forget there are very few trees out here. Those that pop up close are stunted and small. Look at those few cattle huddling with their heads in the shade and their rumps out to the fierce sun. Daphne slowed the car as the gates to the station appeared. They grinned at each other before Daphne steered up Blue Hill Station's twin strips of dirt driveway, and the women craned ahead to the homestead on the hill. Commandingly situated with the long dry paddocks arrayed like a dehydrated swathe in front, the house stood with the blue stone hills in the distance, the peaks turned up like a ruffled collar behind the house. The homestead, silvered by the years, was surrounded on all sides with covered verandas, secret spaces of shade depending on the direction of the sun. In every direction, the paddocks disappeared into rock and saltbush-strewn lots. Across the yard, a windmill rasped slowly in the gentle, hot breeze as the car pulled up. When Daphne opened the door, she thought fancifully that the creak from the windmill sounded a lyrical welcome as she got out. Then Soretta opened the screen door and came out to welcome them up onto the main veranda. Daphne looked across to check Lorna had her seatbelt off, but discovered the door open and her travel mate walking with sprightly energy towards the steps. Soretta met her at the top. You must be Mrs. Lammerton. Daphne tells me you came here to help deliver my dad. Lorna nodded. Now that is a true story. I didn't imagine one day I would meet his daughter in the same place. She'd reached the top without using the rail or losing her breath, and shook Soretta's hand with enthusiasm. Daphne suppressed her smile. She was a goer, that Lorna, she thought, as she carried a plate of scones, kicked Lorna's door shut, and followed the older lady's example and hurried up the stairs. They all paused and turned to look back over the dry paddocks and the driveway. Daphne said, It's wonderful, Soretta. Soretta's gaze rested on the dry paddocks in front of the house, drifted across to the empty dam. It can be. You should see it when it's not in drought. Her eyes skimmed every direction as if her heart was breaking. I don't want to lose it. Of course you don't, said Lorna. I think this boarding house concept is a wonderful idea to bring in some income. 100 kilometres west of Mica Ridge, another windmill pumped water from the hard ground in the red afternoon sun. Barbara Tompkins, lean and sun-browned like all her family, absently folded the clothes from the swaying wire and ran over in her mind the jobs she needed to complete before nightfall. Barb flicked a glance at the darkening horizon, looking for the men from the camp. Lifting a corner of her apron, she mopped the bead of sweat on her brow, until a sudden gasp from her 4-year-old daughter, who was sitting in the shade, spun her around. He bite me! Gwyn's lip dropped as she stared at the twin red marks on her hand, and sick horror exploded in Barbara's brain as the words sank in. Her worst nightmare. The men weren't in yet, and she was alone. Dropping the basket, she frantically scooped Gwyn from the play rug, scattering homemade farm animals and tiny fences, while the unmistakable slither of a snake disappeared under the tank stand. Shit! Shit! Her daughter whimpered as Barbara bolted for the back steps of the veranda. Stay still! Don't move! Of course, Gwyn began to cry and struggle in response to the fear in her mother's voice. Immobilize the limb. Bandage! Bandage! Barbara spotted the fruit bowl where her husband always kept the wide roll of elastic bandage, and she sat her daughter on the table. She picked up the wooden spoon she'd left there earlier when she'd been making the dough. With a superhuman effort, she tried to make her voice more reassuring. Even tried a wobbly smile that didn't fool either of them. If you sit really quiet, it won't sting as much, and Mummy needs to wrap it up with this spoon to keep it still. Can you do that? A trembling nod and a tear glistened at the edge of those huge eyes that were so like her father's. Barbara couldn't contemplate a reality of Gwyn not being there, but the sickness of deep fear coiled in her belly. Mummy's going to ring the flying doctor, then Daddy. The colour suddenly leached from Gwyn's face as her eyes rolled back and she began to shake. In Mica Ridge Flying Doctor Base, the phone rang and Billy reached for it. It had been a slow day for her, though not for Daphne, who was off late, and she picked it up with excess energy. Mica Ridge Base, Dr. Green, can I help you? Doctor, thank God, it's Barbara Tompkins from Golden Ridge Station. My daughter's been bitten by a snake. Billy switched the phone to loudspeaker and wrote swiftly as the words poured from Barbara. Gwyn. Bitten by unidentified snake 5 minutes ago. Her stomach tightened. Had she seen that name on the immunisation list last week? She quickly switched her mind back before she missed anything. Bandaged hand, splintered, already vomited, pale, shaking. Not good. That's fine, Barbara. You're doing everything right. Firm bandage, not too tight, enough to compress the lymphatics but not the blood flow. That's good. A splint is good. Try to keep Gwyn calm. Maybe even lie down with her. Hold on, and I'll give you a time to expect the aircraft. She shot a look across at Morgan and Rex. They'd moved swiftly to stand in front of the large map pinned to the wall and were working out the direction and flight distance. Daphne arrived back from rechecking the aircraft drugs and took in the situation in a glance. Billy saw the moment Daphne's face paled as she realised this was the family she'd stayed with. Morgan turned to watch Billy, and his gaze narrowed. I'll come with you and Daphne. It'll be tight for space, but there's enough room. You'll still be in charge of the medical decisions, and Daphne will ensure the aircraft cabin is secure as always, but you might need help. He nodded at the phone. 35 minutes, tops. We'll be on the ground around 5 p.m. Get Barbara to drive to the strip with the child when we fly over the house. It's best not to move her until just before we get there." Rex strode from the room to start his pre-flight check of the aircraft, and Daphne disappeared into the medical supply room to gather extra equipment. Morgan picked up another phone as Billy repeated the instructions to Barbara. Then Morgan said, "Tell her I'm onto the consultant at the Children's Hospital in Adelaide, and he'll connect us with a venom specialist from his end." Barbara listened as Billy repeated the information. Her voice cracked as she lost some of her control. "Hurry!" Billy mentally hugged the woman. "Hang on, we're on our way." After she hung up, Billy followed Daphne into the supply room while Morgan made the next swift call to the consultant and arranged a callback number on the satellite phone in the aircraft. Then he nodded as they reappeared with the extra equipment. "There's a strong chance we'll need to intubate, or, failing that, we'll put the LMA in and Daphne will be managing the rest. While she's experienced at placing the laryngeal mask and either bagging or connecting the ventilator, I can be the extra hands when you need help. Daphne will sort us all into the best spots." Despite her pale face, Daphne's voice was calm as she explained, "Adelaide will have the antivenom ready when we get there." She didn't say that there was a chance they wouldn't get there in time, but Billy understood and grabbed the extra pediatric resuscitation kit Daphne thrust into her hand before she took off at a brisk trot after Rex. Barbara's daughter could die if they didn't get out there fast enough. As Billy glanced around to see if she'd forgotten anything, Morgan had switched the base over to Broken Hill. She shot past him out the door and heard his "slow down" as she came out into the afternoon heat. Billy obediently slowed her pace to a safer, hurried walk and followed Rex up the steps into the plane. Thankfully, the pilot had finished his meticulous walk around. That was a bonus. With summer here, there'd be plenty of light for hours of flying yet. Daphne secured the cabin once everyone was seated. They'd removed the second stretcher in case Morgan needed to be in the rear of the cabin on the way back. But for now, Morgan had climbed up beside Rex. Billy couldn't help being thankful they had him along as well. Once they were in the air, she and Daphne began to go over the protocols for treatment on arrival. Then Billy quickly reread the instructions on pediatric treatment for snakebite in case she'd forgotten anything. She stole a look at her watch and winced at the thought of Barbara waiting for them. Half an hour later, Barbara Tompkins heard the sound she'd been straining for in the distance, the drone of a plane. Thank God! She eased herself off the chair. Her daughter had twitched uneasily in her arms for the last 20 minutes, and Barbara prayed as she picked up her bulging shoulder bag. Gwyn had been limp and her breathing shallow while they'd waited, but Barbara had hesitated to try to rouse her in case she shifted Gwyn's tiny hand and pumped more of the venom around her small body. She'd given up trying to reach her husband. She'd left a note, but he'd eventually find the missed calls and contact her. Goodness knew where she'd be tonight. Not that it mattered, as long as Gwyn was okay. She didn't allow herself to contemplate anything worse, or her brain wouldn't remain calmly sensible, which was the most important thing. She heard the plane pass over the house, and she picked up her keys to the spare truck and hurried out with Gwyn in her arms. Driving with Gwyn's head in her lap, she sent a silent thanks that her husband had made that cattle grid over the landing strip paddock, and she didn't have to open a gate. She parked just as the plane touched down and chewed her trembling lip, fervently pleading with God to let the flying doctor save her baby. Billy took one look at Gwyn's condition, another quick look at Morgan, and decided to intubate right away. They moved inside the aircraft to be out of the sun, and without the second stretcher, there was room for Morgan and Daphne to put an intravenous cannula into each of Gwyn's arms. Billy drew up the drugs for rapid intubation. In the quickly increasing heat, Billy held the laryngoscope in her left hand, visualized the vocal cords, and, without taking her eyes off the airway, held out her right hand as Morgan handed her the endotracheal tube to slide in. All the while she could feel Morgan's quiet confidence in her, and, surprisingly, she drew strength from that. They barely spoke as all members of the team, despite their relative newness together, anticipated the needs of the others. Then it was done. Gwyn's airway was secured. Billy inflated the cuff, took the CO2 detector from Daphne to check the position of the airway, and then handed her the tape to secure the tube. They connected the bag. Morgan squeezed the Air Viva bag, and Gwyn's little chest rose and fell with the movement. Everyone in the cabin seemed to breathe out at the same moment. Morgan's murmured, "Well done," came from somewhere in the background, making her eyes sting. Billy heard Barbara's sob from behind the pilot's partition, and her fingers trembled involuntarily in response. She blocked the sound out as she concentrated. Daphne had the ventilator to connect as soon as Morgan disconnected the Air Viva bag. They all glanced at the monitor, and Billy added a sedative to the IV lines. "Let's get this young lady to Adelaide," Morgan said quietly. Daphne rose from the kneeling position and rearranged everyone until she was happy with how they were seated, and belted. Billy was in the doctor's seat, the perfect position to watch the airway, at the top of the stretcher where the little girl was safely strapped in by the special pedimate child's harness. Rex had added the extra adult seats from the wing locker, and Morgan was positioned to the side of Gwyn's abdomen. Daphne was in her usual spot, facing backwards towards the cabin, with her back to Rex's on the other side of the partition, and Barbara had been extricated from the front to sit next to Morgan and could reach across and touch her daughter at an angle. Billy saw Daphne check equipment and that IV lines were in place with pressure bags to allow them to run during the flight. "Everything secure?" Rex asked. "Cabin secure," Daphne said. That flight was the worst of Billy's life. By the time they'd handed Gwyn over to the specialist nurse in intensive care and made sure Barbara had been connected to the social worker to find somewhere to stay, it was almost 7 o'clock. Her hands, now that they were allowed to, were shaking uncontrollably. Travelling back to Mica Ridge from Adelaide, Morgan manoeuvred Daphne up beside Rex, and he sat in the back with Billy. After a few minutes of flying, his voice broke the silence between them. "How do you feel about the care given at the scene?" Billy blinked. That was all she could think about. It seemed Morgan knew she was rehashing. She took a breath and seized the opportunity to talk. She knew it would lessen the chance of it keeping her awake later tonight. "I thought the intubation went well, though my hands were a little shaky at times." She spread her fingers and grimaced at their steadiness now. "The intubation couldn't have been better." Morgan's quiet words did a lot to settle her nerves. "You, the rest of us, and Barbara did everything we could to save Gwyn." Billy's stomach plummeted. "Do you know something we don't? Is Gwyn still fighting?" He smiled at her. "Last I heard, she was improving slowly. There were positive signs she'll win. What I'm saying is that if you do that well in all your retrievals, the majority of our patients will survive. Some won't, but you can't do the impossible. And your best is outstanding. Welcome to the team, Billy." Billy's throat felt tight with the unexpected release of tension his words allowed. Eventually she would speak, and as they flew into the darkening skies, she and Morgan went over the details of the retrieval until all her questions were answered. What they'd done well, what they could have done better, what they'd do next time. By the end, while she was emotionally exhausted, her mind was quiet. They didn't arrive until late. Billy got her wish to see the town glowing with fairy lights, the multi-orange lights of the mines glowing like decorations, and she fell silent as they circled over the well-lit mica ridge. For the first time, she had a moment to think of her daughter, hoping that Mia was keeping up her end of the bargain and doing the right thing unsupervised at home. Thank goodness they weren't in Sydney. The next day, Daphne kept them updated with Gwyn's battle in Adelaide, and after the last instalment at 3:30 p.m, she left to go home. Billy and Michael had gone to retrieve a station owner with a suspected heart attack, but the trip had become complicated when his condition deteriorated en route and he required cardiac compression mid-flight. By the time they'd handed him over to the coronary care team in Adelaide, it had been another late night. Morgan was still in the control room when Billy went in to collect her bag, and he called her over to his desk. "Good job. I just spoke to the hospital. Tom's critical, but stable, and on his way to theatre for a bypass. His wife has arrived." "Thanks." Billy shuddered. "He was critical when I left, and it's good to know he's stabilised." His eyes narrowed, as if to see what she was really thinking, or see under her skin. She wished he'd look away because she felt raw and exposed after the harrowing trip, and she needed to regather herself before going home. She'd had her run of intense emergency medicine over the last 2 days, and she was feeling a bit fraught. He said conversationally, "How'd the resus go?" Better than it could have. "It was tricky with just Michael and I, but he's good. Next time, I'd be aiming to have my drugs prepared before takeoff if there was a chance they might be needed." He nodded. "Sometimes it's hard to gauge." "It's reassuring to have managed, I guess." She thought about the harrowing 10 minutes and the hyper-alert state she and Michael had been in after they'd managed to get him back, and shuddered. "You did well, Billy." His voice lowered. "Really well. I said it yesterday. We're pleased to have you on the team." It should have sounded patronising, but it didn't. It sounded genuine. Proud, even. And the underlying relief for another patient making it into the higher level of care at the hospital showed how much he cared about their patients. "I've got to get home." It had been a traumatic day. Cardiac compression and bagging in a small aircraft was hard work, but they'd kept him alive until they'd landed. "I know." There was something in his voice that said that wasn't all he knew. It was her turn to frown. "Daphne rang. Mia had an..." He hesitated, corrected himself. "A slight accident on the way home from school. Daphne said not to worry, and she'd stay until you came in." Billy's eyes widened and she grabbed her bag. "You should have told me that first." His voice was level. "You need to debrief from work initially before the next crisis comes along. We're in a high-stress job." "Mia's accident is a crisis. Why am I still here?" She spun on her heel and headed for the door. It was dark when Billy pulled up outside the dingy flats, and all the lights were on in her side of the house. When she opened the door, the smell of onions and tomato and possibly basil hit her nose, and she remembered for a second that she hadn't eaten for about 6 hours. "Mia?" "I'm here," Mia replied in a small voice from behind the back of the lounge in front of the silent television. Daphne appeared from the kitchen and smiled reassuringly at Billy. "Spaghetti bolognese when you're ready," she said, and then disappeared back into the kitchen. Mia had her arm in a sling. No plaster, so maybe it wasn't broken. She was lying on the lounge, and Billy could see a graze down her other arm and left leg. Her heart squeezed. She sank down on the edge of the lounge. Poor baby, what happened? And she hadn't been here. Mia looked so lost and young, and for a moment Billy could see the unsteady toddler the first time she'd badly grazed her knee, bewildered by the concept of pain and blood and needing Mummy's arms. Billy felt her throat close up as she knelt down and hugged her daughter gently. All her love for the most important person in her world flooding out in a wave. Heightened, no doubt, because yesterday she'd spent a large part of her day with another mother who had very nearly lost her daughter. Sometimes she felt that no matter how hard she tried, she wasn't there enough for Mia. Tears rolled down Mia's cheek. "I'm sorry." "Sorry?" Billy's brow creased. "No." These should be her words for not being around when she was needed. "Don't be silly." She stroked the hair back from Mia's forehead. "What happened?" "I stacked Trent's bike." "Trent? The young man?" "Well, accidents happened. Trent has a push bike?" Mia shook her head and Billy sat back. "A motorbike?" Then Billy remembered yesterday's wish list. A vision of her daughter's hair and fragile skull flying free as she risked life and limb. Fabulous. Not. "You've been riding someone else's motorbike? This Trent?" She could feel her face heat, so she took a breath, and then another one. She tried not to think how hurt she was that Mia had let her down again, and hoped she'd had a helmet on. She also tried to remember that her daughter had probably had a shock from the accident and had been waiting all afternoon to break the news. But it was freaking hard. She took another breath before she trusted herself to talk. She said in a level tone, "I had a big day too. Yesterday, a 4-year-old was bitten by a snake and almost died. Today, I had to ventilate a man in an aircraft until we landed at the hospital. I thought the both of them were going to die for most of the way." She looked at her daughter, battered, bruised, tense and wary, and sighed. "I'm glad you're not too badly hurt. I'm also sorry I couldn't trust you not to get up to mischief while I was at work supporting us both." She stood up, closed her lips on more of what she shouldn't say. Instead, she said, "I'm going to have something to eat," and strode into the kitchen, where Daphne was waiting. "Thank you, Daphne." Daphne shot her a sympathetic glance and then looked away. "I hope you don't mind that I've taken over your house." Billy gave a bitter laugh. "Feel free. I'm not doing such a great job." She crossed to the stove and lifted the lid. A billow of fragrant steam rose to meet her, and rich red meat bubbled. Billy eyed the dish of drained spaghetti. "You," she said with heartfelt appreciation, "are a champion." When she looked at Daphne, she seemed to be squirming under her mild compliment. "Food will help enormously." Daphne smiled. "I'm glad." She inclined her head towards the lounge. "She's okay. Probably sprained her wrist, so I put it in a sling. It was swollen, but I don't think it's broken. She's got good movement." Billy nodded. I'll have a look later when I've eaten and cooled down. I might be a bit unsympathetic if I touch her now. They smiled at each other, and Billy couldn't believe how good it felt to have Daphne there. It was like old times with her aunt before she died. She'd missed the company, the shared adult conversation, and poor Daphne was copping it. Did she come home on her own? Daphne shook her head. Trent came with her, knocked on my door. He was shaken. He seems like a nice boy. Must be a reasonable young man, because he was more worried about Mia than the bike they'd dragged here, which looked terminal to my untrained eye. We'll probably have a visit from his parents then. She put her head in her hands. Billy could hear the sounds of Daphne dishing up her plate as she spoke. I'm not a mother, but at least I could see she was worried about upsetting you, Billy. She lifted her head. Daphne was right, and Mia wasn't badly hurt, just shaken. It could have been a whole lot worse. She sighed and thought about the retrieval today. Tom from Jinder Station arrested mid-flight today. We got him back. Daphne sucked in her breath and put Billy's plate in front of her with a clatter and covered her mouth. I know the family well. I've been out there for one of the stockmen. Billy nodded. One of the station hands met us on the airstrip. His wife was away. Daphne looked pale. How is he now? Billy pulled out a chair. Sit down. Alive. Critical, but stable. Daphne was shaking her head. Morgan didn't say that's where you were when I rang to tell him about Mia. Morgan wouldn't. He was a professional, a calculated professional, one who could hold information until he deemed it right to impart. She'd known a calculating man before. Note to self. Are you astonished he didn't tell you? Daphne glared out the window as if she could see him. No, probably not. No useful reason for me to know, he would have thought. To her surprise, Billy found herself defending him. You're on your day off, and you've had a big week too. But Daphne wouldn't be diverted. How terrifying for his wife. She checked the clock. I'll ring them tomorrow in Adelaide and see if they need anything. Thank goodness I have another day off. Billy finished the mouthful of truly incredible pasta before she spoke again. He's stable. I think he'll come through. In an effort to distract her, Billy asked, So, what did you do today, before my daughter brought her dramas to you? Daphne blinked, rubbed her forehead as if to think. Oh, I drove out to Blue Hill Station and looked into boarding there. Billy felt her stomach sink. Daphne gone from next door? Funny how disappointed that made her feel. Move out of here? Were they so bad to live next to? Knock it off, Billy. This wasn't about her. This was Daphne's life. It was mainly to help out a young friend. We flew Lachlan in the day you arrived. He's lucky to be alive. His granddaughter is doing a great job even though she's only 22. The drought's making it tough to make ends meet on the station. Billy could hear the concern in Daphne's voice. This was important to her. Is anyone else there with her? A German backpacker, 1,000 sheep, and a pack of kelpies, was the dry reply. Billy raised her brows. A lot to manage. No wonder it's tough. And she's on her own. If it rains, she'll be fine. For the moment, she's having trouble week to week, and I've offered to be a boarder. I've always wanted to try living on a station and never had the chance. This one's close to town, and it's a huge house. Plus, it'd bring a little extra cash and company if she wants it. Like an extended farm stay. Billy tried to sound enthusiastic for Daphne. We'd miss you. She looked at Daphne's face and caught the embarrassment and telltale spread of colour up her neck. Her new friend really didn't take praise well. Daphne looked away. I'm sure you won't. Billy looked down at the food in front of her before raising her eyebrows again. Yes, of course we will, though it sounds right up your alley, and I'll still see you at work. I've checked out the distance, Daphne said hesitantly. Morgan said I could do on-call from there. The actual homestead is just under 10 kilometres out of town, even though the property runs almost to the South Australian border. There was another hesitation before she said, You never know. You and Mia might be interested in moving out of town as well one day. There's a school bus that goes past the door, and it would mean Mia wouldn't have the after-school time lag. As if relieved to get it all out, Daphne stood up and bustled away to put her own plate in the sink, then washed it vigorously. It's none of my business, of course, she said over her shoulder, but I thought I might as well run the idea past you. Billy thought about it and was surprised by how much the idea appealed. She'd wanted to try station life, and she wouldn't need a manager if it wasn't her station, and Daphne would be there. Before she could say anything, Mia's voice called from the lounge. Mum! Billy stood up as Daphne dried her hands and prepared to leave. I'll go next door. If she needs to stay home tomorrow, I can drop in and check on her every now and then. Billy put her hand out and touched Daphne's shoulder. Thank you. For looking after Mia? For everything. She waved to her half-eaten plate. It's just what I needed to retain my sanity. Daphne looked ridiculously pleased, and Billy wondered just what the past had done to this woman, who was possibly the kindest person she'd ever met. The next morning, Morgan stopped Billy as she walked past him to put her bag away. How's Mia? She glanced at him coolly. He'd known she would be upset and withheld telling her until he decided the time was right. Well, he had no right. Bruised and sorry for herself, she's staying home today. His voice was level, but she had the feeling he knew he'd blotted his copybook. I thought you might have called in sick to stay with her. She looked at him, lifted her chin. He wasn't the only professional around here. Thought of it, but she's 16, and I didn't want to let everyone down. He nodded, didn't say thank you. Did she really need him to? Daphne mentioned she was thinking of moving out of town, renting a room on a station, she said. His expression didn't change. But then it didn't change much that she noticed any time, except when the sudden smile surprised her. She didn't like him, remember? She told herself. I was thinking I might try that too, she said. Still no expression. Well, that wasn't very helpful. Did he think it was acceptable for her to add 10 kilometres to her drive to work? But he hadn't said no either. Billy decided to ask Daphne if she would take her out to meet Soretta. If that went well, then Mia could lump it, along with Morgan. Chapter 6. Soretta and Billy hit it off right away. They both believed in getting things done and agreed to give it a 1-month trial period. Mia wasn't happy, which was an understatement. "I cannot believe you are doing this to me," she said when Billy told her the news. "Again! Are you trying to ruin my life?" Billy tried not to react. "I'm trying to stop you doing that." She was happy with the calmness in her voice. Mia was anything but calm. "By incarcerating me on a drought-stricken, desolate sheep farm where I won't even be able to wash my hair because they won't have enough water. It'll be 100 degrees out there." Billy's temper strained at the edges. "Soretta says there's still enough tank water. You'll just have to be careful with it." "Oh, goody. And what's more, I'm not coming home on the school bus like a baby." "You have to. Daphne doesn't always get off on time." It was becoming more difficult to keep her voice level. Mia folded her arms across her chest, and Billy noticed that her daughter's shirt buttons on her uniform were bulging a little. The thought sent a pang of nostalgia through her, and her anger drained away. She had to accept that Mia was turning into a woman in front of her eyes. A bolshy, cranky when thwarted woman. Mia said, "I'll wait for you to arrive and pick me up from school." I might not get off on time either, and 2 hours is too long to wait, anyway. Billy closed her eyes for a second. "You can go in with me on the days I work, but you'll catch the bus home. But I'm afraid that's the end of the story. Starting on Friday." Mia glared at her. "You'll regret this." Billy took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and said in a very quiet voice, "I hope not. But if it doesn't work, we'll come back here." Moving out to Blue Hill Station took only a week to organise. Thankfully, it fell on the Friday rostered day off, so Billy even had a 3-day weekend to settle in. Morgan had arranged with the powers that be that one of the town flats would remain as an on-call backstop for the nights on call, which would be good as well if staff were too tired to drive home after a call-out. He demurred when Billy tried to thank him. "It's something I've been thinking about for a while. And not just for you and Daphne." Liar, Billy thought, because she could see the concern in his eyes. But maybe he had a point. She could imagine a close shave with wildlife, especially at dawn and dusk, when her reflexes were likely to be half asleep. But she wasn't going to think about work this morning, or her boss. She was thinking about her days off and her new place of residence. This move would be the perfect way to see if she really did want to live on the land, as opposed to being forever an in-town person. And she didn't have to buy a high-maintenance place to find out. Tonight would be their first night at Blue Hill Station, with the only downside being Mia was not excited, to say the least. But Billy got that. Maybe they had moved way too often. Hopefully, this would be a turning point for both of them. Daphne and Billy drove their cars out to Blue Hills as soon as Mia left for school, and Billy could see Daphne's smiling face in the rearview mirror as she led the way. It was a peaceful drive. They didn't pass a single soul and had wide open spaces on each side of the road. The sun behind them, Billy felt like a pioneer heading into the distance with purple flowers and waving yellow grass flashing past, and the open plains ahead of her. When she turned into the station gate and started up the rock-strewn driveway, Billy felt the surge of excitement, like a wave of new adventurous spirit she'd been waiting to unleash. She couldn't keep the smile off her face. She braked close to the veranda steps so they could unload. She'd find out where to park later. Daphne pulled up next to her, and they grinned at each other as they got out. Soretta, dressed in well-worn jeans, a workman's shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and socks, pushed open the screen door and gestured them up the steps. "Welcome, ladies. I'm afraid I have to run away, but make yourselves at home." When they got to the top step, she flashed them a smile as she picked up one of her boots. "Something's come up over at the yards, but I'll be back later to answer questions." Billy blinked, but Soretta on a mission was unstoppable, and obviously she had no doubt they'd manage fine on their own. "Have fun shifting stuff," she said. "I'm on my way out to move sheep to another paddock." Billy was still processing this when Soretta added, "I had a brilliant idea last night." She pulled on her boot. "Grandad and I don't use the lounge rooms between our rooms and yours, just the kitchen and the dining room occasionally. So you can have a sitting room each in the middle." She pulled on the other boot. "Make them your own spaces. Shift the furniture in any of your rooms. You'll see which ones are ours, so use any of the others. Only thing is, Grandad has the ensuite, so we'll all have to share the other bathroom." She stood up, stomped her feet to settle them into the boots. "If this boarding thing doesn't work, that's okay too, but we'll see how it goes." She glanced at her watch. "Sorry, I didn't expect to do this today, but needs must. I have to be early before Klaus gets tied up doing other things. He lives in the shearer's quarters over the hill. Call me if you need something urgent explained." She pulled her phone from her pocket, showed them the bars of reception, and put it back. "My mobile works most times when I'm away from the house, but not all the time. The number's stuck on the fridge. I'll be back at 3 to go see Grandad. The school bus gets here at 4:45. She waved and trotted down the steps and strode across the yard. A minute later, they heard the roar of an engine, and then she came out of the shed on a quad bike, 2 kelpies jumping and skidding in excitement as she putted down the driveway until she broke right and steered across a paddock. Billy shook her head at the dynamo that was their landlady. Daphne seemed to think everything was as it should be. "She's a doer, that Soretta." Billy dragged her eyebrows back down to normal and followed after Daphne, who'd now stepped inside and was standing in the central hallway. "Ah, yes," Billy murmured as she began to take in the lovely old home. In her brief look through during the week when she'd met Soretta, she really hadn't noticed much except the fact the house was out of town and seemed large enough to not find themselves living in each other's pockets. Of Soretta, she'd decided she could admire her drive and stamina, and the rest she'd see how they went. Billy got on with most people, and she just hoped Mia would settle in. She hadn't missed the fact it would be very different to the featureless duplex they'd moved out of, or that people would be coming and going, which was a good thing for Mia. With Soretta gone and time to soak it in, now she saw the ceilings were high, pressed metal, and painted white. The hallway was divided by white painted wooden arches down its length, where it gave way into rooms. "The house is huge," Billy marvelled quietly as they walked slowly down the wooden boards of the hallway, and she shook her head at the stained glass bottoms of the windows, shining multicoloured light as the sun streamed through the eastern side of the house. They peered into each of the 7 bedrooms, except Lachlan's, which was right at the end of the long arched hallway, and Soretta's, that lay opposite. They perused the available rooms, which were closer to the kitchen, and after them, the sitting rooms. Each bedroom had its own latticed double door leading out onto the veranda, and an outside chair and round table. Inside both of the high-ceilinged rooms was a wall of built-in robes, plus a colonial writing desk, a deep chest of drawers with mirror, and a wrought-iron double bed, stripped bare, with blankets folded on top. The furnishings were old, but shone with years of polish applied with love. The two sitting rooms were elongated rather than wide, and one of them was scarce of furniture, which suited Daphne and her belongings. The other was fully furnished and showed signs of more use. Both had huge bay windows with a window seat overlooking out over the veranda. A couple of folded newspapers and an open book that Billy suspected had been there for a while lay on the side table in her sitting room. Both rooms had black metal fireplaces with tiled surrounds. Billy's had a wing chair pulled up in front of her fireplace, and she could imagine being tucked up there on a cold winter's night with her own book. The ambience was a world away from the concrete rooms staring into the blank metal fence they'd just left. The slow excitement that had been building all day expanded into a burst of anticipation. She had a job she loved, a safe place for Mia to come home to, and a connection with the land she'd always dreamed of, even if she'd really be a farm-stay renter. Finally, things were coming together the way she'd always hoped they could. They tore themselves away from the sitting rooms and moved onto the enormous bathroom, with clawfoot bath that neither of them could imagine having enough water to be able to use. But there was nothing wrong with dreaming. A dark green tiled shower with an old-fashioned bird neck shower rose, and an oak dresser with an oval basin set into the wood. The separate toilet room sported wash basin and stained glass mirror and was almost big enough to fit another bath. Daphne shook her head at the elegance of the fittings. Soretta's grandmother certainly had a flair for interior decorating. "The whole place is beautiful," Billy whispered, as if a ghost might hear. "I know her gran died, but what happened to Soretta's mother?" "She died not long after Soretta was born. Her father was killed in a farm accident, so her paternal grandparents brought her up, but her grandmother died 2 years ago. Lorna told me Lachlan's never been the same since her death, which makes it harder for Soretta." Billy got that. The homestead showed all the signs of warmth and family and a woman's caring touch, but it must have echoed a little emptily with just Lachlan and Soretta in it. "Well, her gran certainly created a beautiful home. It's perfectly maintained. How can Soretta keep it like this, with what she does outside?" Daphne smiled. "I asked. Apparently, she spends 15 minutes in a different room every day, cleaning and vacuuming lightly, early in the morning, so the task is built into her day, and she leaves the rest until its turn. That way she gets through the lot. She said she started it when her gran died because she felt close to her when she was doing it, and hasn't stopped." Billy shook her head. Homemaking wasn't her strong suit, but she could appreciate the sense of consistently doing a small amount. She'd always kept her current rooms clean and tidy, and this would be an absolute pleasure to maintain. At least Soretta will have a few less rooms to do now. Daphne had chosen the room beside the minimally furnished sitting room on the left side of the hallway, and Billy was very happy with the 2 rooms next to each other on the right. They moved back into the hallway, and her head shook in spite of herself. But it's still a huge house. Daphne had been right when she'd said there'd be room for more lodgers if Soretta wanted. The place could hold more than 3 families very comfortably if everyone pulled their own weight. Billy smiled at the sudden image of Soretta dealing with anyone she considered slacking. Miss Mia might be in for a shock. In the separate dining room, the glory piece, a formal table with enough seating for 12, was polished rosewood. The matching high-backed chairs, with a carver at each end, were regal. Billy could almost imagine the original settlers hosting dinner parties for men with curling moustaches and military jackets. Back in the kitchen, the table held seating for 8, and the long, scrubbed timber setting looked like it had seen generations of family life. Rex was coming at morning tea time with a U-hire trailer full of Daphne's furniture. Billy thought again that Rex might be sweet on Daphne, but when she'd raised the idea discreetly with her new friend, Daphne had blushed and denied it strenuously. Such was Daphne's embarrassment that Billy had backed away from the statement. But she still hadn't changed her mind. He'd been pretty quick to offer help and hadn't taken no for an answer. The two women spent the next 2 hours unpacking their suitcases, stocking the food pantry in the kitchen, while looking at the bare cupboards and each other in dismay, and generally settling in. Daphne had brought her slow cooker, and before they'd gone too far, she'd slipped in a corned beef piece to simmer away quietly in the corner of the kitchen to make sandwiches with later, and packed cakes and slices she'd cooked at the flat into empty round Tupperware containers, which Soretta seemed to have hundreds of. Love the idea of the corned meat. Billy rubbed her hands together. I can see we'll have to come to an arrangement. Of course, we can take it in turns cooking, but I need you to make the suggestions. Daphne nodded happily at the prospect. I love cooking and adore my slow cooker. It only takes a minute to start a whole meal that cooks while I'm at work. I read that somewhere, Billy said dryly. I never believed it, she muttered. The dogs barked, a farm sound, and one they'd have to get used to. Mia had always fussed over other people's animals, even though they'd never had a pet. In fact, Billy hadn't had one since her parents died. The dogs kept barking, and she wondered if they'd drive her mad. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. They both looked up. Oops. So barking dogs meant visitors. She must remember that. Billy went to the door and looked out. A towering 4-wheel drive, festooned with spotlights and bull bar and requisite kelpie chained on the back, was parked under the tree. A tall, confident young cowboy, sporting a very rakishly tilted akubra, was coming up the steps. I'm Clem, Outback Internet Service. The strapping young man had a delightfully slow drawl. He shifted his hat to one hand with that innate country courtesy she'd noticed time and again since she'd moved here, and carried a bulky toolbox easily in the other. Billy pushed open the screen door. Excellent. I didn't think you'd get here today. Thanks for coming so quickly. He nodded, and she loved the way he put his toolbox down and automatically bent and slipped off his boots before coming in. Once he was inside, she waved him into the dining room, where the Wi-Fi internet had originally been based. Second door on the left. He paused. Soretta home? Billy shook her head. She's sorting sheep at the yards. The young man nodded and carried his toolbox and equipment down towards the original but defunct internet connections, and she turned back to Daphne. Billy raised her hands in disbelief. That was quick. It takes weeks in Sydney to get a tradie. I checked with Soretta, and she was happy if I put the internet back on for the house. I can't believe it might actually happen today. In case Daphne thought she expected Soretta to pay, she added, My expense, of course. Mia wouldn't cope without it, and I'm partial to the occasional download myself. Down the hallway, the young man had begun a soft-whistled country ballad that floated up into the high ceiling. I remember what you said about the Swiss workers leaving, and I'll ask him about routers and see if we can get it to the shearers' quarters for casual labour when Soretta needs it. Billy mightn't be much of a cook, but she could make things happen if all it took was money and organising. It felt good to be part of a group enterprise. She grinned. Might give that nice young man a chance to say hi to our landlady while he's here. The next vehicle to arrive was Rex's. The dogs barked. Daphne glanced nervously at the mirror placed strategically beside the back door, and Billy nodded to herself. Thought so. By the time the rattling trailer was dragged up beside the veranda steps, the two women had moved outside to watch him pull up. Except, unexpectedly, Morgan uncoiled from the car at the other side, and Billy wished she'd taken a bit of time checking herself in that damn mirror. Nobody said he was coming. He looked Billy's way and lifted his akubra. Another man who looked good in a hat. Apparently she was starting to develop a fetish for cowboys. Didn't know you were coming, Morgan. Daphne sounded pleased, and Billy suspected she might be a bit pleased herself, though it was hard to tell under the jumbling pros and cons of more exposure to Morgan thoughts in her brain. She considered the concept and decided to hell with it. She was very pleased. The more men, the better for shifting stuff. It was just the shock of seeing people she associated with work in her downtime. Nothing else. Said I'd give Rex a hand, Morgan drawled. Billy smiled, satisfied she'd given nothing away, and decided she'd stand somewhere with a good view. Nothing wrong with enjoying the eye candy working out. It also meant I could check just how long it was going to take you to get to work when I need you. She'd initially looked guiltily away at her naughty thoughts, but this comment had her attention. 12 minutes. I timed it. She raised her brows. Thankfully, her voice sounded surprisingly cool and composed, and she decided maybe she shouldn't watch. Nah, too good an opportunity. She leant back against the house wall and ogled for the hell of it. Rex opened the rear of the trailer and jumped up into it, and Daphne's long lounge began feeding out into Morgan's hands. Billy watched, and the day just got better. She could feel the smile curve her lips as Morgan's biceps bulged, and his back straightened when he took most of the weight until Rex jumped down. Then Rex backed his end. Nice end, Rex, she thought, and flicked an amused smile at Daphne's rapt gaze. The men heaved it towards the veranda steps and inched up. That lounge looked very heavy. She smiled across at Daphne, who still had that dreamy look on her face. Seriously, a crooked finger towards Rex would have worked a treat, but she had the feeling Daphne would take a while to get to that point. No doubt that was where the land lay, though. Maybe she and Daphne could have a good giggle about this later, and the thought of having a friend she could share this silly stuff with was a new, shiny notion she hugged to herself. Another magical 20 minutes, and all was done. It was very short work, as the two well-muscled men easily set Daphne's lounge and chairs and solid coffee table in her sitting room, then rearranged the remaining furniture good-naturedly for the third time. It was a novel experience to see how extra muscles could make house shuffling a breeze. Then it was over, and suddenly the kitchen was a whole lot smaller as everyone sat down. Morgan sat next to Billy, his big frame encroaching on her space. His muscled leg grazed hers and gave off heat from his exertion, and far from repelling her, she actually enjoyed the subtle briny scent as he reached for a plate of sandwiches. Daphne, of course, had produced a feast, including scones and cream, and presided over the big pot of tea with a beatific expression on her face. Someone was having fun. Billy wished Soretta was here, because it felt very strange to host a tea party in someone else's house, and it might have distracted her from the man beside her to see Soretta in action when there was company. Daphne had sent a plate of scones with that nice young internet man over to the shearing sheds to share. He said he'd worked here once before and knew where they were located and would check out the best way of setting up Wi-Fi over there. Morgan's leg shifted against hers again, and Billy almost rubbed back, but instead she inched her foot away slightly. In desperation to stay centred, she clutched at the idea that this was her home, for a while at least. These were her people, and how she felt more settled since moving here than she had for a long time. The concept gelled into conviction. She concentrated on the reality of waking up here tomorrow, and the next day, and the next, out on the land, distanced, and not just by time, from the past. The concept of freedom from worry about what Mia was getting up to brought a joy to her heart and a smile to her face that she hadn't expected. Suddenly, everything was easy. She turned to Morgan. Unconsciously, she shared the new lightness she could feel expanding inside her. "Thanks so much for helping us settle in and for moving the furniture." His eyes widened as she blasted him with her newfound happiness, and he looked startled for a moment. This was the most expressive she'd seen him since meeting him. "And thank you," he said gravely. She looked around the table and then back at him, then cocked an eyebrow, confused now. "What for?" The smile. "That wasn't yours," she said without thinking, then blushed. Cripes. She sounded like an ungrateful wretch. I mean, she drew a breath. "You're welcome," and reached across for a scone she didn't want, to give her hands something to do. Soretta drove back for lunch to see how the tenants were going and saw the car and trailer turning out of her gate and onto the road. Apparently, she'd just missed the furniture arriving. It had been kind of Daphne to send scones across with Clem and to sort the internet over there too, which would help enormously with keeping transient staff. The sun glinted off the new satellite dish on the roof of the homestead, and a small portion of the weight around her shoulders lifted. Another bonus. Klaus was pleased at the idea because he had a girlfriend in Germany, and she wasn't happy with his email silence. And the new satellite dish would make it easier to get the ear tagging and mustering done like they used to, when they could entice staff for heavy workload days. She leapt lightly up the steps onto the veranda, and when she walked into the house, the aroma of cooked meat moistened her taste buds. And suddenly, ridiculously, she felt like crying. It was like her grandmother was here again, which was stupid because neither of the smiling women were her gran, but still she felt a warmth she hadn't sensed for 2 years, and she had to blink several times and hope nobody would notice. She needed to remember that these women, one of whom she barely knew, and the other she'd only known for a short time, weren't here forever. But it was nice to have feminine company again. Almost as if the homestead felt welcoming, instead of a guilty burden she'd shouldered as she'd tried to shield her grandfather from their loss. And maybe now it would be less responsibility to maintain the house the way her gran had liked. That load would lighten, And it would all happen while she'd be doing what she needed and loved to do. Work out on the land. This is the end of CD3. The book continues on CD4.